to be one of my best seminars ever. You guys definitely signed up for the right one, put it that way. So if we check out the agenda here, kind of give you a rundown, a little bit of what's going to happen, and I'll give you a better summary here in just a second. So basically, the beginning of the seminar here, we're going to start after our introduction, obviously, we're going to start with lake conditions, and we're going to break up all these factors that between weather and also kind of lake conditions. I said how weather affects bass. There was no real catch-all phrase. So we're going to talk about lake conditions. We're going to talk about weather. We're going to talk about other factors. We're going to talk about a lot of different things tied in, basically all the factors of fishing that you need to be taking into account that can change on a day-to-day basis. So we'll basically take about 50 minutes to discuss lake conditions. Then we're going to take a 10-minute break. I always find it's good to take a quick break so everyone can use the restroom, kind of regroup after hearing someone talk about fishing and fishing theory for 50 minutes. The brain can get a little bit distant. So I want to make sure you guys have time to regroup and take care of whatever you need to. Again, this is going to be recorded. So if you do need to step out at any time, don't worry, you'll be able to check out whatever you missed in the recording that I'm sending. And then after the break, we're going to be continuing to talk about lake conditions a little bit. And then after that, we're going to transition to weather conditions, take another break. We'll talk about more weather conditions, and then we're going to talk about a few other factors that affect the bass near the end of the seminar. It's going to be a jam-packed seminar. I got a ton of info I'm going to be throwing at you guys. So buckle in, and it should be a really good one. So I think everyone should be good. Just, again, leave any questions, or if there's anything that's weird, just type it over in the Q&A. If my screen's glitching out or something like that, just let me know and we'll jump straight into it. So let's start out with the key factors to consider. These are basically all the factors that are going to change on the lake on a day-to-day basis. They could change within the hour, within the day, within the week. And you need to know how all of these factors affect bass. Now, it's a lot of factors, and there's a lot of nuance within each factor. So I'm going to really go through in detail every single one of these factors step by step, showing you how changes in each of these conditions affects the bass. Also talk about the relative importance of each of these conditions or these factors. And then we're going to be really dialing in how these factors even interact within each other. That's going to be a little bit difficult because there's so many factors. So this is something I'm going to be doing more through my discussion as opposed to with specific slides. So definitely make sure you're paying attention, and I'll make sure I'll call out when I'm connecting the dots across slides, and I'll pull up different slides, things like that. So just make sure you're paying attention in those moments because it's going to be a little bit complicated because there's so much going on, but I'll hopefully explain it as clear as possible and everyone will be on board. So we're going to start out here. We're talking about lake conditions for basically the first half of the seminar. It's a huge factor to consider. You got water temp, water clarity, water level, current flow, and presence of grass. Now, obviously, some of these elements are tied together, and they're also tied together with your weather factors. So there are a lot of correlations, a lot of connections between these factors. There's not just this perfect universe where you have one of these factors in isolation. All of these things are interacting with the lake on any given day. So changes in one may or may not affect the bass differently depending on how another factor changes. So there's a lot of complexity here. We're going to narrow it down and make it as easy as possible to understand, though. Don't worry about that. That's why I spent so much time creating all these graphics, because I want to make sure I teach it as clearly and as concisely as possible. And then we'll also have a few other factors we're going to just spend some time talking about at the end that are not really related to lake conditions, weather conditions, but they are other factors that do play a role in bass fishing. So we'll kind of cover all of that, and we should be good to go. So let's just jump straight into it. We basically are done with the introduction, and if you ever think everyone is all good, let me just check a few things here to make sure we're all good to go. I think we're recording here. Okay, perfect. Good deal. So let's jump into the first factor, lake conditions, and we're going to be talking about water temperature. So water temperature is the first factor we're going to take into account. Now, water temperature is something that's talked about a lot in bass fishing, but personally, in my opinion, there aren't that many, water temperature doesn't have as big an effect on the bass as a lot of people make it out to have. there are a lot of other more important factors, but we're going to start with the water temperature because this is the number one factor I think a lot of guys take into account when they go to the lake. They say, what's the water temperature? They use this to determine where the fish are, positioning, seasonal patterns, what baits to fish, all these things. And while it does have an impact on all those factors, it's not nearly as important as a lot of the other stuff we're going to be talking about in this webinar. I did go through though, and I wanted to give you some key water temperatures to look out for. Usually what I find is that the individual water temperature itself doesn't actually matter. What matters is where you are relative to these key water temperatures and whether you're passing it warming up or whether you're passing it going down, so cooling down. That's really the key you need to think about. So I basically am going to earmark 5 different water temperatures on the rise and 5 different water temperatures on the fall that you guys need to really pay attention to. We're going to start with the warming water temperature. So this is basically from the spring going into the summer or winter going into the summer. The first water temperature to really pay attention to when that water is warming is the 50-degree mark. That is the magic number for me that indicates that the bass are going to start making their spring movement. They're going to be moving further into the backs of the creeks. They're going to move into shallower water and they're going to start preparing to spawn. We're going to go through all of this in a graphic here in a second, but I'm just going to stay with the text format first, and then I'll explain it with graphics as well for those who are a little more visual learners. So this is kind of the first key weather or first key water temperature I focus on. Now, I've seen that water temperature change happen when there's maybe 48-degree water temperature. Those fish start to make the move when water temperatures are 48. I've seen it happen when the water temperatures hit 55. So this is not a perfect number to base this early spring movement on. There are going to be exceptions to all these rules, but in general, around the 50-degree temperature mark, that's when those bass start making their move up shallower. Now, once that temperature hits 50 degrees, those bass will make that move shallower even if the water temperature falls back down below 50 degrees. So sometimes in the spring, you'll have a week or two of really warm weather. It'll push those fish up shallow because the water temperatures will get into the 52, 53, 54 degree range. Then you get a really big cold front and it drops that water temperature back down below 50 degrees. But those fish have already made their move. They've made that transition up to the shallow water. They're not going to go back to deeper water. So this is kind of one of those deals where once you hit the temperature, you are now stuck in that early spring. You're not going to be able to go backwards, really. There's no way to return to the winter. Those fish, once they make that move to commit, they commit there. So just keep that in mind. The next thing that next water temperature you really see playing a big factor is the 58-degree mark, the early spawn. This is the water temperature in which the first wave of bass will start to move up to spawn. And I've seen bass spawning in 58-degree water temperature on the upper end of a reservoir or in the backs of creeks and pockets, even though the water temperature on the main lake might be 47 to 52 degrees. The dirtier the water, the shallower the water, the quicker that water warms up. So you'll find that sometimes bass will be spawning in March on your fishery or maybe February, and that'll be your first wave of spawning bass. But then the next wave might not spawn for a month, and the last wave might not spawn for 2 months. So you have to really make sure that you're aware of your water temperatures across the lake if you really want to hunt that spawning bite. Usually this happens first when this water temperature is 58-degree water temperature will occur first, again, on the upper end of the lake, the dirtiest section of the lake, and you'll be able to find the first wave of spawning bass. But then really you won't find that the majority of your bass will spawn until the coolest water temperature on your lake is 65 degrees. So once you have the coolest water temperature in your lake being 65 degrees, that's when those bass are pretty much all going to be done spawning. What this means is that you need to have water temperature on your main lake at 65. Back in the creeks, you might have water temperature in the 70s or 75. Even if you go further up the lake into the rivers, you'll find the water gets warmer and warmer and warmer. But on the lower end of your lakes, on the main lake, you'll find that a lot of your water temperatures will be cooler. So you really will find that the majority of your bass will be done spawning when the coldest water temperature in your lake hits 65 degrees. This is when those bass start transitioning to the post-spawn period. They're going to be post-spawn, after the spawn. Some of the bass will already be out on offshore structure at this point because, again, upper end of the lake back in the creeks, the water temperature will be warmer. And then on the lower end in the clearer water, you'll find that the bass will be more in their early post-spawn stage. Now, next thing that you really need to pay attention to is that 68-degree water temperature mark. The 68-degree water temperature mark basically indicates early summer in my book. Now, there's a little transition between 65 and 68 degrees. It's a little bit tricky because you're going to have 68-degree water temperature on some parts of your lake, and you're going to have 65-degree temperature or even maybe 58-degree temperature on other parts of your lake. So you might find that all three of these stages are going on your fishery at the exact same time. Another thing that happens during this window of these three water temperatures is you're going to have your shad spawn starting and your bluegill spawn starting. Your shad spawn usually starts when that water temperature hits that 65-degree mark, and a lot of the shad will start spawning up in the backs of the creeks and up at the top part of the lakes first, because again, that's where you have your warmer water. But then that shad spawn will continue, and basically it'll just move out of the creeks, out to the main lake, or further down your lake, depending on what your water temperatures are. So that 65-degree mark is usually when those shad start spawning. The shad spawn is usually occurring on a lot of your main lake and secondary points up really shallow in the first hour of the morning. So that's when those shad will be spawning. I'll talk about that in a graphic here in a second and go through all this graphically as well to make it all make sense. But that's at least kind of the high level of it. And then the bluegill spawn usually starts when that water temperature hits 68 degrees. And the bluegill spawn happens every full moon and every new moon the entire summer. We'll talk about moon phases and lunar phases later on in the seminar, but just know that 68-degree mark is kind of the key mark where those bluegills start to spawn. Finally, with the 68-degree mark, that's usually when a lot of your shad start to move offshore. So your bluegill will move up shallow to spawn, your shad will move offshore to get an offshore structure, and that's when your kind of offshore ledge fishing, structure fishing bite really starts, 68-degree water temperature. Finally, once you hit 75 degrees, you're basically in the full-on summertime mode. You're not going to have, actually, you don't have the shad spawn. I don't know what that was about there. But I don't know what this whole summer thing was about. Let me say this is a full-on summer mode. I don't know. Oh, I was messing around with the boxes to make sure they're perfectly symmetrical, and I probably didn't copy over the right thing. It takes so much time, guys, to get these boxes to line up perfectly. You have no idea. So apologize on that. I try to focus on all this other stuff. I missed the important stuff. So basically, when 75-degree water temperatures or more hit, you're on your full-on summer mode. Bass are going to be in their summer patterns, offshore structure for a lot of the fish, and then shallow brim bed bites for other bass. Now, if we kind of take this to a graphic and explain this all graphically, let's kind of walk through how all of this starts affecting the bass. So let's start with the 50-degree mark. We're just going to assume that this creek right here is on the midsection of your lake. The water temperatures are kind of somewhat consistent throughout the entire creek, maybe a little bit cooler on the main lake, a little bit warmer in the back of the creek, but not major water temperature differences. So when you have 50-degree water temperature, a lot of your bass are going to be set up in the middle of your creeks to the mouth of the creek. So kind of the middle to the mouth. So if we kind of actually bring in this bass, you'll have bass kind of in two stages. Some bass in the main lake and kind of bass in the middle of the creeks. A lot of your bait fish are going to be out more towards the mouth of your creeks or the first third of your creeks. A lot of your crawfish are going to be about halfway back in your creeks on shallow rocky banks. Therefore, your largemouth are going to, or smallmouth or spotted bass, any species really, are going to be feeding up on crawfish in the middle of the creeks on flat or on steeper rocky banks. And then some of your largemouth are going to be out in the middle of the creek channel, feeding on shad in a little bit deeper water. Now, once that water temperature is 50 degrees, a lot of these bass are going to start migrating further back in the creeks, preparing to spawn in these shallow pockets that are warming up. At the same time, some of the shad will also be moving back into the creeks as well to follow the bass. So you'll have a lot of shad kicking up in the backs of the creeks. You'll have the shad that are more towards the main lake start moving in the middle of the creeks, and you'll have another wave of bass that's behind them. So you'll basically have bass splintered up. Some of them will be in the very backs of the creeks chasing shad, maybe still feeding on some crawfish. And then you'll have a lot of your bass in the middle of your creeks setting up here. Then as that water temperature starts to warm up into the early spawn period, you'll find that the bass in the back of these pockets are going to get on the beds and start spawning. But you're also going to have these other bass that kind of are still hanging out in the middle of the creek in a little bit cooler water, just chilling on some of these secondary points and on these banks chasing shad. Then, as that water temperature hits 65, the majority of your bass are going to be done spawning. These bass will have moved into the pockets and will pull out. These fish may have moved back out towards the main part of the creek. And this is when your shad will start to spawn on your docks, on your main lake points, stuff like that, secondary points. And that's where the bass will be. They'll basically be feeding up on those shad. Then at the same time, when this is all happening, your bluegill are going to start making their move into these creeks to start spawning really heavily. And as that water temperature hits 68 degrees, you'll see that your shad start to kind of get finished spawning and they start making their way offshore. They'll start moving more towards the main part of the lake and the first third of the creeks, and a group of bass will follow them out here. At the same time, you're going to have bluegill that move into the backs of these pockets and coves, and another percentage of the bass are going to move to feed on the bluegill. That's where they'll be. So you'll have some bass on bluegill in here, some bass on the shad out here. And then as you really get more into that 75-degree range, a lot of those shad will move way out to the main lake out here. The bass will move out, and a lot of those bass will stay on these spawning bluegill because those bluegill will spawn all summer long in the backs of these pockets. So that's kind of the transition on your normal man-made fishery with shad and some bluegill or some sort of panfish. Hopefully that all made sense. Let me know in the Q&A if that was all good. I'm pretty sure I covered that thoroughly, but just want to make sure there's no confusion. So as we get those questions, I can reiterate those at the break. Let's jump to the next factors. The next factor that you'll see is lake conditions where you have cooling water. So this is where the water temperature is falling. Now, this is basically going to cause the fish to have a reverse cycle of what they did in this warming pattern where the water temperatures are warming. So we're actually going to start on the right side over here because we're following the water down. So in this example, this is the summer situation. Water temperatures are 75 plus degrees. But then as those water temperatures start to cool, they start to drop, you'll find that your thermocline is going to start deteriorating or evaporating. And the thermocline we'll talk about here in a little bit, which is a little bit more connected to air temperature as well. And so don't worry, we're going to talk about the thermocline later. But the thermocline will begin to disappear during when that water temperature is 70 degrees. This is going to cause a lot of your bait fish to start moving into the backs of the creeks to find water with better oxygen quality. And at the same time, the bass will start moving with them. This is usually also when that bluegill spawn is going to be pretty much done and the bass kind of stop worrying about the bluegill and they start really focusing on these shad they're pushing back in the backs of these creeks. Then, as you get that water temperature dropping into the 60-degree range, the thermocline is pretty much completely turned over. You have the lake turning over, which is something you hear a lot. This is the beginning of the turnover, the fall turnover. Thermocline disappears. Again, we'll explain what that is here with air temperature in a bit. And then you have your thermocline being fully gone at 60 degrees. And a lot of your bait fish are going to be way back in the backs of the creeks. And that's where your bass will be. They'll push back in the back of the creeks. After that, you have after that, you have the late fall. And my threshold for these water temperatures is specific now to kind of what the bass's mood is. So this was all based on thermocline and actual lake conditions. These factors over here are less about lake conditions and more about just bass mood and behavior. So with the late fall, you'll find that at 52 degrees, that's when your top water bite ends. So usually when that water temperature is above 52, you can catch a lot of fish on top waters and moving baits in the backs of these pockets. However, when the water temperature hits 52 degrees, the top water bite seems to really die off. You can still catch a few, but it's not as good. And the bass begin feeding heavily on crawfish. For whatever reason, around 52-degree water temperature in the fall, the crawfish start really getting active. I don't know if they spawn during that time or something happens, but those bass get really fixated on crawfish. And there are still some bass feeding on the backs of the creeks and the shad, but you'll also find that a lot of bass start feeding on crawfish. At the same time, you'll find that a lot of these shads start migrating back out more towards the main lake as that water temperature cools to that 50-degree mark and even cooler. Finally, you'll have the water temperature dropping below 50. And this is kind of considered the early winter. And this is where you'll start finding a lot of your bass suspending more over deeper water, though there will be some bass still positioned on crawfish in the backs of creeks, even when the water temperature is in that 48-degree range. And then really once you get below 48 degrees and get into like that 43-degree temperature, the bass become extremely lethargic. They will be suspended out in front of points, over deeper water, as well as in the middle of your guts and drains, feeding on bait fish. And the crawfish really begin to hibernate, so they stop becoming as much of a factor. So you really want to focus more on your shad when those bass, or when that water temperature drops below 45 degrees, in that 45, 43-degree range. So that's kind of how water temperature plays a factor. And as you can see, it does have an impact, and it kind of dictates somewhat the seasonal movement of the bass. However, all of these points of reference, these water temperature ranges, can completely change depending on all the other factors we're going to talk about, including water clarity, water level, air temperatures, moon phase. All those things can throw off this process. So while this is a good generic baseline to start with, all of this can be thrown completely out the window depending on all the other factors that we're talking about. So definitely take these as a guidepost, but then you're going to have to adjust when all of these things happen based on all the other factors we're going to talk about. Really, this is the least important thing we're going to talk about the entire seminar. I want to get out of the way first because it's something I know a lot of guys are going to be asking about. But now let's get into the real juice, the stuff that's going to really make an impact. So the first thing, honestly, and the most important factor that I pay attention to more than anything when I go to the lake is water clarity. Water clarity dictates a lot of factors for me, but really the number one thing water clarity dictates is how deep I need to be fishing. That's huge. If you know how deep you need to be fishing, that's really going to help narrow down where you should be fishing. It's also going to narrow down whether you should fish offshore or shallow. So let me show you a new and improved revamped graphic. I spent a lot of time getting this together, so hopefully you guys are going to enjoy this one. Basically, it's my water clarity graphic on how deep to fish based on different water visibilities. You have dirty water, 0 to 1 foot of visibility, stained water, 2 to 3 feet of visibility, clear water, 4 to 5 feet of visibility, and then ultra clear water is 6+ feet of visibility. Now I'll go through each of these boxes to explain. I'll also be sending you guys handouts with all of this and all of these like major takeaway slides like this. I'll send you guys some handouts with all of this that you can then print off and take to the lake. So don't worry about having to scribble all this down off of the slides. I'll actually send you a PDF file with all of this in there. You guys can then, again, take to the lake. So if we take a look, basically, you see that I have some different depth you should fish based on different water visibilities. When you're fishing in dirty water, 0 to 1 foot of visibility, I say you should be fishing in less than 8 feet of water. The main reason this is the case is because bass are going to be feeding on bait fish, and bait fish feed on these little microorganisms called plankton. Plankton grows on hard objects like a stump, a rock, a brush pile, some sort of object that's in the water, and it can only grow where it's getting hit directly by sunlight. Now, what you'll see is that as the water clarity increases, the sun is going to be able to penetrate further into the water. What this means is that plankton can grow on objects in deeper water. So in 0 to 1 foot of visibility, the plankton can grow out to, let's say, 8 feet. That's about as deep as that plankton will grow. Then as the water visibility gets clear, that plankton can grow on hard objects like stumps and rocks out to 15 feet of water. Then as you get into deeper water, 25 feet of water, you'll find that in 4 to 5 feet of visibility, that plankton can grow all the way down to 25 feet. And then when you get into ultra clear water, the plankton could grow as deep as it wants. It could grow 40, 50, 60 feet deep, and there's other factors to consider. Now, this is really important because the plankton is the food source for the bait fish. The bait fish is the food source for the bass. So if the bass want to eat, they basically need to find the bait fish. And if the bait fish want to eat, they need to find hard objects in less than 8 feet of water, for example, when the water visibility is 0 to 1 feet. This means that you can basically predict that if a bass is going to be feeding, it's going to be feeding in less than 8 feet of water in this water visibility. Same thing goes for stained water. These bait fish are going to be feeding a little bit deeper in the stained water because they're going to be, the sunlight's going to reach deeper into the water, growing plankton on objects that are deeper in the water. And so because those plankton, those plankton are growing deeper, the bait fish will feed deeper, and the bass will feed deeper. Hopefully that all makes sense. Same thing as you get to clear water, you'll find that the bait fish can feed even deeper, the bass will feed deeper. And then finally, in the ultra clear water, you're basically going to have a situation where these bass can feed anywhere, or the bait fish can feed anywhere they want. If there's a stump out here in 50 feet of water, those bait fish can still feed on it because that sun can penetrate all the way down to the bottom of the lake. However, there's one factor that actually influences this a little bit more than anything, and that's the thermocline. The thermocline is something, again, we're going to talk about when we get into the air temperature. So we'll pull these slides back up, both the other side and the thermocline. I don't want to get into this just a second, but your thermocline is going to be really important, and that's dictated a lot by your air temperature, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But if the thermocline isn't present, which basically the thermocline is only present in the summer, if you're fishing in the fall and the winter, even into the spring, the bass can basically be anywhere. So when you're fishing in an ultra clear reservoir, it's a lot harder to actually find the fish because you can't use these water clarity guidelines to cap how deep you need to fish. You could fish out here in 70, 80, 90 feet of water. Like right now on Table Rock Lake, there's fish that are feeding on shad in 90 to 100 feet of water. Bass, they're feeding in 100 feet of water. So when you get to ultra clear lakes, it makes it a little more difficult to find the fish because they can go anywhere. They can go shallow, they can go deep, and they spread out a lot more. In the dirtier and stained and clear water, you have a few guideposts that you can use that will dictate this. Now, one thing you really want to pay attention to is the water clarity, or with your water clarity, is what is the consistent water clarity? What you'll find is at times the water might muddy up really fast from your stained water to your dirty water. So it might drop from 2 to 3 foot of visibility to 0 to 1 foot of visibility very quickly overnight. Well, if that happens, there's going to be a transition period in which the plankton grew on this stump till, let's say, Wednesday, when that water was 2 or 3 feet of visibility. Then we got a really heavy rain, and by Friday, that water visibility is now 0 to 1 foot. However, the plankton is still alive and growing on these stumps in deeper water, in 15 feet of water. So the shad will still feed on this stump in 15 feet of water, even though the water visibility is 0 to 1 feet. However, after a certain period of days, let's say 2, 3, 4 days, if the water doesn't clear back up into that 2 to 3 foot range, let's say it stays in that 0 to 1 foot of visibility, what you'll find is that all that plankton is going to die around the stump, and those shad will be forced to move shallower, which will move all of your bass shallower. So you have to make sure you know what the consistent water visibility is. Small 2-3 day changes in visibility are not going to impact how deep these fish feed. If you find that you get to the lake and the water is really dirty for 2-3 days and then starts to clear up, those bass will never move out of that 15 feet of water. They'll stay there. And I've caught fish in like 0 foot of visibility, like just dirt water out in 15 or 20 feet, just because that plankton was growing out there and the water dirtied up really fast. It was like an overnight muddying of the lake, but then 3 days later, the lake was clear again because all the water pushing through. So just something to kind of keep in mind. But that is kind of the guideline. So, and Thomas asks, talking about dirty water, what if there's a lot of debris in the water? Is that a problem? The debris is not that big of a deal unless when you're graphing offshore, you're using a fish finder, because when there's a bunch of debris in the water, it's hard to differentiate big debris mats of like leaves and stuff from bait fish and fish. So that's really difficult. I'll make a YouTube video about that. Actually, I have some really good screenshots of that. But anyways, and then Joshua says, do you tend to stick to stumps, brush more than rocks or creek bed? It doesn't matter to me. I'm just using stump in this example just because that's what I put in here. The plankton grows on any hard object, brush, rocks, bridges, pieces of concrete, a truck that's been dropped in the water, metal, any sort of hard object will hold plankton. Stumps is just what I used in this example. It's not actually specific, put it that way, to like what I'm talking about. This is just just an example, but any sort of cover can work in this situation. It kind of depends on the lake I'm on. And another question from Brendan is, what do shad feed on in the winter? a lot of times that plankton will grow out to the bottom and there'll be like standing timber out in the middle. There'll be big brush piles. A lot of times those shad will actually move up and down the water column a lot in the winter. They'll be down to 90 feet, then they'll come up to 30 feet and go back down to 90 feet. They kind of go all over the place in this clear water. So they might swim up and feed in 20 feet and then swim back down to 90 feet. It makes the fishing very difficult because the shad move around a lot and kind of mess around. There's a lot of nuance to it. Really, they will feed on what's ever available, but they usually stay in the deepest possible water that they can be in. And then they'll swim shallower if they need to. If, for example, if there's only cover up here in 25 feet, they'll sit over 100 feet all day. And then when they want to feed, they'll move up to 25 feet, feed for 10 minutes or 20 minutes, then pull back out. So it's kind of tricky sometimes, but hopefully that makes sense. Cool. So now let's jump over to our next factor. As you guys can see, there's a lot of factors to go through, so I'm trying to rip through them as fast as I can. If I'm going too fast, make sure you leave some questions because I do want to make sure I answer everything. These were quick questions here, and I'll answer them in the break. I don't want to overlook anything trying to go fast, but I do want to get through everything. And also let me know if this is all good and helpful over in the Q&A too, just so I kind of get a gauge. In these virtual seminars, it's hard to tell if it's making sense, if it's not. So yeah, really appreciate any feedback as I'm going along. So next you have water level. And we see a question from Matt, how does barometric pressure affect this? We'll talk about that with fronts. Don't worry about that. So we'll be covering that. So let's talk about water level next. Water level is a huge factor. Basically, water clarity and then water level are the two biggest factors for me that really impact my fishing over any other factor. Water clarity, water level are huge. And I just think a lot of guys overlook the water level and the water clarity a lot because they don't think about how it actually affects the fish. So let's just kind of take a general look at water level. I have some graphics here. We have a lake, for example, at normal pool. That's just where the lake is normally. And we have some shallow grass. Then let's say, for example, you have low pool where all the grass is out of the water. Then you have high pool where all the grass is under the water and maybe you have some flooded bushes and trees. Whenever you have this changing water level, which happens a lot on your man-made lakes where you have heavy rain, then they pull the lake down and maybe they pull it too much, it can mess up the fish a lot. And there's actually the Major League Fishing red crest they just had. That was a big factor, a big player, because that water was fluctuating a ton. And really what you'll find, and I'm actually going to jump over some other graphics here, is that the water level is going to dictate where the bass are moving, where they're feeding, and also it will impact this water temperature chart that I talked about earlier. This basically gets thrown out the window when you have fluctuating water levels. You can take this and literally throw it in the trash because it doesn't matter because the water level is going to screw it all up. So let's just take a look here at the water level on Google Earth. This is just a little pocket I found on one of my lakes, and you have normal pool, you have high pool. I know it doesn't look that much higher, but we're just going to call this high pool. It's the best I could find. There's some flooded bushes here. So this is like, let's say the water's 2 or 3 feet high, but it could be way up in these trees for all that matters. And then we have low pool. This is obviously a lot lower than this. So when you have the low pool, the water dropping out, it's going to affect the bass differently. So the main thing to think about is when those fish are in normal pool, the standard, I guess, movement of these fish is going to be, they're going to be more towards the main lake in the winter. They're going to move in to these kind of mouse of the pockets on these points and stuff in the pre-spawn. They'll move into the bays and backs the pockets to spawn in the spring. Then after the spring, they'll move back out to these secondary points in the post-spawn. They'll move back out to the main lake in the summer. That's kind of the traditional movements. You got winter, pre-spawn and post-spawn, and then spring where they're spawning, and then back out here for the summer. That's all well and good in your normal situation, normal pool. However, that's not always going to be the case. So let's say, for example, we have a couple different situations. Let's say that instead of having these fish out here in the winter, sitting up at normal pool, let's say that water rises and you get a high pool. Well, usually when the water level rises in the winter, even though those fish want to be more towards the deeper water, they will actually push into the creeks and set up more in their pre-spawn positions because that high water is basically changing the depth at which the plankton is growing. they're forced to move shallower, move more into the creeks, because as that water gets deeper, the plankton can grow. It doesn't grow as deep. And so a lot of the areas that they would potentially be feeding on out here in the middle of the lake are going to be too deep, and they have to push in shallower to their more pre-spawn positions. They'll also push further back into the creeks. So if we kind of give this example here, they're going to push further into the creeks when that water temperature or that water level rises in the winter. They'll push further back. Now, let's say that instead of having these fish in their winter patterns, let's say now they're in their pre-spawn patterns. So they're right here and they're in their pre-spawn, and then that water rises. The water comes up 2-3 feet. Well, in that case, it's interesting because when that water rises up in the pre-spawn, you would think then that those bass would go straight to the bank because the winter fish moved one step ahead. So you would think those bass would move one step ahead into these flooded bushes. Now that happens at times, but a lot of times what I find is instead of moving all the way back into the flooded bushes, they'll actually just move shallower in their pre-spawn areas. So for example, if they were sitting up here on this secondary point, like right here, when the water was normal, when the water rises, they'll just move like maybe 20 yards into the same exact depth of water they were in when they were in normal pool. So if they're sitting in 10 foot of water in the pre-spawn when it was normal pool, they'll just move up to where they're in 10 foot of water on high pool. Another way to think about it is they'll move to the old bank line. So they'll move basically where the old bank was, but is now flooded with water. So old bushes, stuff like that, that might have been in 3 feet of water before the water rose. Now they're in 10 foot of water. So they move up into that old bank line. That's what they kind of do in that pre-spawn period. Then once you get the spawn, what you'll find is that the spawn can get completely screwed up by high water levels, like really screwed up. Because what will happen is that normally those bass want to move in here into these bushes and start spawning. The problem is that when that water gets really high, those bass will push up and try to think about spawning, especially when that water temperature hits that, 58 to 65 degree range. But the problem is that when that water rises up really fast, usually the Corps of Engineers or the people managing the lake want to pull that water back down to normal pool as quickly as possible to kind of relieve the pressure on the shorelines and on the homeowners, stuff like that. What this means is that that water level is going to rise up really fast, and then it might start falling like a foot a day or 2 feet a day. What this means is that, for example, if a bass right now in normal pool would lay their eggs like this up on this grass, usually they can lay their eggs. If the lake is at normal pool consistently, they can then sit there for a week. The water level never changes, and they can move back out afterwards, and their eggs will have hatched. They'll be fine. The problem, though, is that when that water gets high, if they lay their eggs up here now in, let's say, 3-4 feet of water, when that lake is 3 or 4 feet high, but then the lake starts falling pretty quickly, pretty soon their eggs are going to be completely high and dry if they drop that lake back down to normal pool or drop it too much. If up here, they might not have enough water on the eggs to make them survive. They need to spawn a little bit deeper. And what this will mean is that the bass will actually stop their spawn when that water gets really, really high. When that water jumps up really fast, the bass will stop their spawning cycle, and they'll just wait for like a week or 2 or 3 weeks sometimes to spawn. As you'll see here then, normally in normal pool, the bass move in here and spawn, let's say when that water temperature hits 58 to 65 degrees. But because now that water's high, they might just hang out here in their pre-spawn locations or maybe just on the outside edge of the bushes, and they'll just sit there feeding up for like 2-3 weeks, 4 weeks. And I find times all the time, like in Arkansas, where usually the bass will spawn in Arkansas in April. But when you have lakes that go up 5-10 feet and they're really high for an extended period of time, but they're slowly falling, those bass might start spawning when water temperatures are 73, 74, 75 degrees. They'll completely just ignore the water temperature factor just because that falling water is too much of a danger to their eggs. If that water falls too much, the eggs are going to die and there's no point in spawning. So they'll just be patient and they'll just wait till that water stabilizes back at normal pool for 3, 4, 5 days. It's not falling anymore. It's staying stable. Then they'll move up to spawn. And I've seen this happen so many times over the years where I'm catching spawning bass in May or June when normally the bass spawn in the end of March or April because those water levels are fluctuating a ton. That's something that a lot of guys just don't pay attention to, because if that water is fluctuating up and down, and it doesn't matter if it's going from normal to high or if it's going from like low back up to normal, if that water is rising up and changing water levels, it's bad for the bass because their eggs, they need to be put in a very specific depth. You can't lay your eggs and then all of a sudden have the water rise up. And when you first laid your eggs, they're in, let's say, 3 feet of water. And then when that water comes up 4 feet, now your eggs are in 8 feet of water. They're not going to get any sun. They're going to die. So they're not going to lay their eggs. They're going to wait till everything stabilizes and kind of chills out. So that's something that, like, that water level, it can screw up this whole cycle then, because now that your bass are spawning in 73, 74 degree water temperatures, this then throws off the shad spawn at times. And I've actually seen sometimes where the shad spawn happens before the bass actually spawn, because those shad, they can spawn on some of the flooded bushes and cover, and they're a little bit less worried about the water fluctuation. And so you'll have your shad spawn, then you'll have the bass spawn, and then you won't have bass moving out to their offshore structure spots till water temperatures are 81, 82 degrees, and it's like July or August, because they're basically waiting for that water to normalize to spawn. And now they just spawned in May, late May or June, because that water finally stabilized. Now, in a couple weeks after they get done, they're going to get post spawn out here on kind of their normal post spawn spots, middle of June, July. And then by the end of July, they're finally out here, where in a normal year, when it's just normal pool the entire time, they might be out on these offshore areas in the end of May, first week of June. So the whole process gets delayed by 2 full months. So this is something that is just crazy that a lot of guys do not take into account, because the fish just get really screwed up by it. Now, there's a good question from Kyle who says, how fast does the water need to rise or fall in order for it to be considered fluctuating? For me, if that water is falling or rising 2 inches, or not 2 inches, if it's moving like an inch or 2 every single day. So if it's going up a couple inches, down a couple inches, but it's a consistent rise or consistent fall, that is bad news. Usually you want that water to be completely stable, not moving up or down, because those bass, they can feel the water falling out. They can feel the current and the movement and stuff, and they're not going to start that spawn until it's stopped, it's dead. And for example, when they were fishing the Major League Fishing Red Crest, the water at the beginning of the week was actually at normal pool. And then the water temperatures were like at 48 degrees. But then as that water temperatures started to rise, a lot of guys thought that those fish were going to move up into the shallow grass and they were going to start whacking them. But even though the water temperatures were 68 or 65, 68 degrees in places, some places the water temperature was in like the 63 degree range, those bass didn't spawn. They were actually setting up in offshore brush piles because that water had dropped halfway through the tournament. Then it rose and got really high. And then on the last day of the tournament, it fell back down to normal pool. So these fish were just sitting out in this brush, just chilling, waiting for this fluctuation in water to stop messing up. Now, once that water temperature normalizes, then they'll move out of those brush piles and they'll start spawning. But a lot of guys messed up in their preparation for the tournament or in their consideration. This just happened to the best pros in the world who were competing for a championship. They didn't take into account that fluctuating water level and the fact that it was impacting those females moving up. So that's something that is, this is a pretty juicy little deal that a lot of guys don't know about, like a little nugget of information that you really need to pay attention to. Now, water level doesn't affect the fish as much when the water is cooling, because they're not worried about the spawn. It doesn't really affect them. So rising and falling water in the winter, or not in the winter, but when the water is cooling down the fall, I don't find it affects the fish that much. So when it's dropping from 70 to 60 to 52, if that water's up or down, doesn't really matter. The big thing is that usually when that fish are shallow, the thing it will do is when the water's higher in the fall, those fish will get up in any flooded cover like shallow grass and stuff. And then as that water starts to fall out, they get to more isolated cover. And it might not even be a brush pile that's like way out in the middle of the lake. It might be just a shallow piece of brush. But when that water's low, they get more isolated targets. And then when the water is high, they get to more shallow targets like shallow grass, shallow bushes. So that's usually what happens. It usually moves the fish, again, to thicker flooded cover when the water is normal pool or high pool. And then when it's low, they'll go to more isolated cover, but still shallow cover. They won't go really offshore usually. There will be fish offshore still, but those shallow fish will just go to isolated pieces of cover. Gary says, when the water is fluctuating up and down, how long does the water need to stabilize before the bass resume their spawn? I'm not 100% sure on that. Just to be 100% honest, I don't know the exact days, but usually I've seen it once that water stabilizes for 4 or 5 days, 3, 4, 5 days, they'll start spawning again. But then if that water starts fluctuating again, they'll stop. They'll pull back out again. So usually, like when that water needs to be stable for like 2-3 weeks for all the bass to like go and start spawning. Like once that water stabilized for a considerable amount of time, that's when all the fish will move up and spawn and then pull back out. If that makes sense. And what about a slow, consistent water level decline? Will that play a major role in their spawn? Yeah, Kyle, anytime the water is falling at all, if it's a consistent 1 inch a day for a month, those bass will not spawn. If it was up in the spring for 7-8 feet, and then for a month straight, it drops an inch a day, or even half an inch a day, those bass aren't going to start spawning because one, they're going to pull up. It's going to take them 3-4 days to lay their eggs. Then by the time they're done, if it might take them 7-8 days to do that, and then their eggs need to sit there for a few more days. If it's falling an inch a day and they spawn 3 feet of water, by the time they're done, those eggs are going to be in a foot or a foot and a half of water. And so it's really, and if they start pulling more water, it's even worse for them. So yeah, any sort of decline or rise is going to affect them. And does the Corps advertise what they're going to do with the water levels? No. You can call them and ask, but it doesn't really do much. We can make predictions, but usually no, it does. They don't really let you know too well. Okay, so that is water level. Next thing we're going to get to is current flow. I want to talk about current flow because I think I can get through this real quick before the end, before the break, and then that way we have extra time to kind of answer questions, which I think should be really good. So let's talk about current flow a little bit. Another factor, and really current flow and water level are linked together. So when you have the water level and the current flow, they're linked together. So as that water's falling or rising, you're going to have current flowing. So as that water goes up or down, it generates current. Now, current flow, what that really does more than anything, and I think there's a misconception about what this does, what the current flow does, and this is just a situation where the current is hitting up against an area like this. Basically what it does is it stirs up the water. And it's kind of like, for example, if you stick your head into a indoor swimming pool where it's slit calm, then you stick your head into a wave pool, or like you go to the ocean, you go to the surf and the water is kicking in, you get a bunch of turbulence and bubbles and everything like that. In the slit calm swimming pool, you can see all the way across that pool, no problem. And you can see end to end. But when you stick your head into a wave pool, you won't be able to see 6 inches in front of your face because of all that turbulence. The same thing happens to the bass. So when you have no current and these bass are sitting here, they can see shad coming up to eat off of a rocky spot, for example, or a brush pile or whatever it is. Because again, this is where the plankton grows. The plankton grows right here on this rocky spot. Depending on the depth of water, obviously, you have to figure out how deep they are. But let's say that it was 2 feet of water visibility, 2 to 3 feet. This is less than 15 feet of water. Let's say it's a 15-foot rock pile. So we know the plankton grows right here. And the shad, they can't feed any deeper than right here. This is the deepest they can feed, 15 feet. So they're going to have to move up to feed here. Well, these shad, they don't want to move up and feed here when it's slit calm, bright bluebird skies, no wind. Because basically the bass will see them coming from a mile away. Again, it's like sticking your head into an Olympic swimming pool. It's indoors and crystal clear. You can see those, what's happening from all the way across the pool. So those shad are at a disadvantage because those bass will see them coming. They'll then get ready. When the shad are up there, they'll ambush them and it'll just be a slaughter. Like those shad don't stand a chance. However, when there's a heavy current flow, that current's slapping these bass in the face and they can't see what's going on. Again, it's like sticking their head in a wave pool. And so these shad, they start moving into feed during that time because it's harder for the bass to see the shad coming when there's currents. So the shad are now at an advantage. They can move in, they can feed really quick on the plankton, then move back out. And those bass, At the same time, they know that those shad are going to use that current flow to start moving into feed. So what they're going to do is they're going to get in position and eat any sort of fishing lure or any sort of moving object, that comes by. So whether it's a shad that swims by their face, whether it's a 6XD striking crankbait, a football jig, doesn't matter. When those bass can't see anything from the current, they're just in this ravenous, they're in this mood where their eyes turn red and they're like, I'm just going to eat anything that moves. And so that current makes it harder for them to see, and they will eat anything. And that's why when there's current flow, you can crush them on a swim bait, a deep diving crankbait, a square bill crankbait. It doesn't need to be offshore areas. It could be shallow water areas. Anywhere there's heavy current, those bass just are going to be more aggressive because they need to react to anything that's moving. That current's going to whip the bait fish by them quickly. Anything that comes by their face, they're just going to have to react to it. And what they usually do is they'll set up behind an object or something so that when the bait fish get washed over, they can boom, jump up and eat them. And so what you'll find is that when there's heavy current, those bass are very aggressive. You can catch them with a deep diving crankbait, a moving bait, stuff like that. But when there's no current flow, those bait fish aren't going to move up to feed. Instead, they're just going to be sitting out here in the middle of nowhere, and those bass, they are going to be waiting for those bait fish to come by. But if you bring a crankbait by their face, they're going to look at it and be like, that's not a shad. I know the shad wouldn't come up here and start feeding randomly for no reason. They're going to come up here because of some factor, current flow or cloudy conditions or sunny skies. We'll talk about all these factors here in a bit. But basically, that current flow is going to change when those bait fish move up to feed. And so when there's no current, those bass will still be sitting in the same areas, but you're going to have to trick them with a slow moving bait, like a shaky head or a Ned rig. The shaky head, I've said this before, probably in other seminars and other videos, is the shaky head's like a Kit Kat bar between lunch and dinner. Eating lunch is like eating the shad when the current's flowing. This is lunch and dinner time. Those shad are up there feeding, you get your full meal. But then in between that current flow, it's kind of like that time between lunch and dinner where you've already eaten, you're not that hungry, but someone comes out with a little Kit Kat bar and they're like, hey, you want to eat half a Kit Kat bar? And you're like, you know what? I'm not that hungry, but I'm not going to eat for like 2-3 hours. Sure, I'll have some. That's a shaky head. That's what the shaky head is to these bass. You drag it around on these areas where you know the bass are and where you know the bait fish will feed at some point, but you can catch those fish with the slow moving baits, maybe a big 10-inch worm, dragging it slow, Carolina rigs, stuff like that. Or up shallow, maybe it's flipping a creature bait or fishing something real slow. But then when the current's flowing, that's you pick up your moving baits, your spinner baits, your crank baits, boom, boom, start catching them. And this is kind of another example. Let's say that current's hitting really hard right here. What you'll find is that your bass will be set up right on this point here. The bait fish will come in to feed. The bass will ambush them. However, when there's no current, so let's say the current is gone, those bait fish will sit out here more towards the middle of the creek because they're safer out here. Those bass will have to kind of chase them around like Tom and Jerry sort of thing, and the bass are going to lose that battle because those shad will just swim away from them, and those bass are just going to tire themselves out. So instead, the bass will just sit here waiting for the current to flow and wait for the bait fish to come to them, and that's when they'll feed. So when there's no current, that's when the bait fish are out here, and you just drag your shaky head worm around. And that's pretty much it. So that's how current affects bass. And is there much difference between wind current and the dam letting it out? No, Gary, there's no difference between the wind current and the dam current. Usually the dam current is just more consistent, so it happens every single day. So you can predict when those feeding windows happen. That's what's like a big deal on the Tennessee River. You'll know when that current's flowing, so you can predict those feeding windows when the shad are up and the bass are aggressive. When there's wind current, a 15-mile-an-hour wind will have a very similar effect to 20,000 cubic feet per second of current. Strong current or strong wind both have the same impact. It's just the wind doesn't happen every day. It's kind of unpredictable. But if there's really strong wind blowing in, boom, 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 that's going to hit on this area, and those bass are going to be all over it. So that's kind of the deal with the wind and the current. They're kind of grouped together in that sense. Awesome. So we are on time, on track, which is awesome. I'm going to take a quick break here, guys. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to, let's see here. Yeah, I'll answer any questions I see when we get back. We're going to take a 10-minute break just so I can take a break from talking, and you guys can take a mental break, just kind of take everything in, and then we'll be back here at in 10 minutes at 7:10 p.m. Central Standard Time. And yeah, just leave some questions for me. I'll answer as many of them as I can. Okay, I am back. Let's get after it. Got a bunch of questions over here, so let me roll through these really quick, and then we'll get through all this. Just give me a second here to kind of roll through these questions. Okay, so Joshua asks, can you explain how wind and current play into boat positioning and casting angles? I'm going to make a video about that, Joshua, here, probably on the main YouTube channel. So just wait on that, and it'll be easier to explain when I have like a drone over the boat and stuff like that. Does current from boat traffic cause the same effect as current from a dam? We'll talk about that, John, a little bit later when we talk about pleasure boaters as one of the factors. When running current through a dam all day flow, how do you predict the feeding times? So usually there's going to be times, Todd, when there's going to be increases or decreases in the current flow. If the current's flowing consistently all day long, that's usually a good sign. But the factors then that will affect that, one, those fish will stay aggressive, but there's other factors that will play into it, including the sun position, the cloud cover, things like that, time of day. So we'll talk about all those factors here in this next 1 hour segment of the seminar. So there's other factors that will play. The current isn't the only deciding factor. It's one of many variables. So we'll kind of explain that. And then James, where would you fish on a lake in high wind conditions, the post spawn? James, that depending on, if I would fish offshore or shallow in the post spawn with high wind conditions, it depends on the water level, depends on if the fish have what the water clarity. There's a ton of factors that can go into that. So it's kind of difficult to explain exactly what I would do in those situations. What I am doing, mentioned it earlier, is I do have an app that's coming out that'll actually take all those factors. We're going to buy it with a bunch of cool data, and we're going to be able to kind of give you guys a better insight on that of what we'd be doing, kind of using the information from this webinar and other stuff that I've done. So that's a complex question. There's a lot that goes into that, but hopefully all the factors here, you can kind of tie it all together and then come up with your own solution once you see how all the factors affect the fish. James says, I fish a lot of amateur tournaments. There's always bad weather situation that happens, high winds and rain. We'll talk about that, how fronts affect fish as well, James, here in a little bit. So it looks like we're going to cover it all, which is good. That means I prepped properly. Let me just share my screen here and we'll jump right back into it. Let's see here. Just give me 1 second, you guys. I'll just be back in 1 second. I need to check something in the house. Just give me one second. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. I had to check something. Okay, so we are back. So let's now jump back into going through all the different key factors. We have lake conditions. The last thing we have to talk about is presence of grass. Then we're going to talk about weather and then the other factors. So if we go back to our agenda, we are right on time. We're going to talk about lake conditions. We'll actually be a little bit ahead of time, which will be good. And then we'll have extra time to talk about weather. We probably need some extra time to talk about that anyways. And then we may even, I'm not going to say we have extra time for Q&A at the end because I always run over on these seminars. There's always so much to talk about, which is always a good thing, but we'll try to leave some time for questions as well during the breaks. So next, let's talk about the last lake condition, which is the presence of grass. So yeah, see that, Thomas, we didn't talk about grass. I got you covered on the grass. So let's talk about presence of grass. And basically, when I'm talking about grass, I mean presence of offshore grass or grass that grows deeper in the water. So for example, grass that grows out to 10 or 15 feet. I can probably, this is not, ignore the current flow part. I'm just making a new graphic. I probably should have had this graphic in here. But let me just put, like, for example, grass that grows like this. it grows out more towards the middle of the lake, and it might grow out to 10 or 15 feet of water. That's kind of what I'm thinking when I say offshore grass. Some of the grass might be like coontail grass, where it may not grow all that deep. It may only grow out to 5 to 8 feet of water, but basically grass that's submerged under the water that grows out in deeper water. Lakes that have this are going to be like a Sam Rayburn Reservoir over in Texas, has some offshore hydrilla grass. A lot of your TVA fisheries, some of your lakes up north have offshore grass as well. So grass that's away from the bank. Now, there can also be grass that's right up against the shoreline, so matted vegetation. That can also work, especially if you're fishing more like Florida-style lakes or lakes that just have really thick matted vegetation. Now, the presence of grass is really key because if we take a look at like this contour map of this point, baitfish are attracted to that grass. Grass holds heat. It also is going to give them protection from the bass. And then within the grass, you're actually going to have areas where there's going to be hard bottom where that plankton can grow. So for example, if we take a look at this situation here, you may have a stretch of rock that's setting up in the grass here. So there's grass growing all around this rock, and the grass is basically going to protect the bait fish from the bass. It also provides warmth for the bait fish, especially in the wintertime. It provides oxygen, which is really good in the summer when the oxygen levels get low. And then there's going to be areas of rock or brush or things like that, shell, that is in the grass that then grows plankton that those bass can, or the bait fish can feed on. So it's not always just the grass that's going to be effective. It's grass plus a combination of some sort of hard cover those bait fish can feed on. Now, the grass, basically what it will do is it will change the behavior of bass completely, in the fact that the shad, they are so attracted to this grass due to all the factors I mentioned earlier: oxygen level, warmth, protection, they can hide in the grass, things like that, that if there's grass in your lake, those shad will basically stay as deep as that grass, regardless of the water visibility. So we had this water visibility graph over here, and even in ultra clear water, if you have vegetation out in the middle of the lake, hydrilla, milfoil, stuff like that, those bass will cap out not by a thermocline or anything like that. They'll cap out at how deep that grass grows. So if that grass grows out to 25 feet of water, that's where those bait fish will feed, and that's where they'll be, even if the water is crystal clear. If that grass only grows out to 15 feet of water, those bass will still be in 15 feet of water because that's where the bait fish will be, and you'll be good to go. I have a lot of lakes in Arkansas that have offshore grass that are super clear. They have very good visibility. And even though the bass might be super deep, usually they might be out here in 20, 30 feet of water with the bait fish. Due to the grass, those bait fish move shallow and the bass will stay shallow, even in the middle of the winter and the cold months. Now, when you don't have any grass, so you go from an area where there is a bunch of grass to no grass, I find that those bait fish are much less likely to hang out in the shallow water. Instead, what they'll do, for example, is they will set up around structure like this point, and they'll stay out in deeper water most of the day, and then they'll move up every once in a while, move up periodically to feed on rocks or feed on a brush pile. And that's kind of how the bass will relate. They'll relate to rocky spots and stuff and wait for the bait fish to move in and out. But your bait fish will stay out here in deeper water because they're safer from the bass. When there's no grass present, those bait fish can escape in 360 degrees out here in the middle of open water. When those bass try to chase them, they can escape everywhere. However, when those bait fish move into shallower water, those bass can pin them to the bottom of the lake very easily, and they can only escape basically in two directions: up, which is at some point going to cause them to get busted up on the surface, which causes schooling fish, or they're going to swim back through the bass and they're just going to get massacred. But when there's grass, the bait fish can hide within the grass. So if we, for example, bring this to the front, these bait fish can hide in the grass, and the bass try to chase them, and they swim out here, and the bass are trying to chase them. They can go boom in the grass and hide, and they can escape the bass. It makes it harder for those bass to actually find them and eat them. So when there is grass, those bait fish will stay shallower. When there's no grass, those bait fish like and prefer to be deeper because that's where they're the safest. Now, this is really key because on a lot of lakes that are deep and clear, even lakes that aren't but don't have any vegetation, in general, your bait fish are going to be deeper, and they're going to set up at the maximum feeding depth. So for example, if there's 2 or 3 feet of visibility, those bait fish are going to feed in 15 feet of water, and they're going to relate deeper than that. So if there are rock piles here, they're going to sit out here over 30, 40, 50 feet of water and only move in every once in a while to feed. Now, this is nice because it creates these feeding windows for the bass. But when you're up in grass, there's not really a feeding window because those bait fish are always around and they're just hiding around the grass, and the bass just kind of wait for the bait fish to swim by them. And the grass fish change, or the grass changes the fish behavior. Instead of bass setting up on one rocky spot and waiting for those bait fish to move in and out, instead what they'll do is they'll set up in this grass and they'll roam a little bit more in and through this grass throughout week to week periods, but they're always up in this grass, and they'll pick little key spots like this right here, and they'll sit there for weeks. They'll sit up right on this little rocky spot for weeks because those bait fish don't really need to move in and out. And so when bait fish pull up here, they'll be here for 2-3 weeks sometimes, and they'll be on one little area, one small stretch of grass where there's maybe some rock, and that's where all the bass and the bait fish are. Where on a lake where there's not grass, there might be 3 or 4 rock piles up and down this shoreline. And you might find that for 2 weeks for like 3 or 4 days, the bass are setting up on this rock pile, and that's where the bait fish feed. The next week, the bait fish move over here and the bass are on this rock pile. And they're moving a lot more. The bass tend to move and shift and change locations a lot more on lakes without grass. On lakes with grass, those bait fish and the bass stay in one spot for longer, and they're going to be staying up on one little key area, one exact cast. So that doesn't really change. There's still going to be bass sitting up on one exact spot, one rock pile, waiting for those bait fish to come up. It's just the grass holds the bait fish in shallower and holds the fish in one spot longer. So really, there's not that much difference between the two in terms of the fact you're fishing an isolated area, but it does keep those fish shallower and keep the bait fish shallower. The other challenge is that when you have grass, you can't really graph for the fish. So when you're graphing around, your graph's going to be covered up by grass. You won't be able to see where the bait fish are, where the bass are. You have to find the fish by fishing for them. When there's no grass, you can graph all this stuff easily with side imaging and down imaging and find those fish. So honestly, for me, it's easier to find fish when there's no grass in the lake because I can use my electronics. When I'm on a lake with grass, I have to make a ton of repeated casts to find those fish. So that is kind of the grass deal. And James says, does it make the bass more aggressive? It does in a sense, because basically the grass is going to act as like a constant inhibitor of their vision. So when a chatterbait or a lipless crankbait pops out in front of their face, the bass want to eat that thing as quickly as possible before it goes back into the grass. So if you get your bait around a fish in the grass, usually they will eat pretty quickly. Now, not all the bass will eat those. So a lot of times there's still factors like wind and cloud cover and stuff that will get the bass more aggressive. So usually in general, they're going to be a little bit more aggressive, but not so much more aggressive that it is going to be a night and day difference. The wind, the current flow, cloud cover, those all affect these bass and make them aggressive as well, and will make them more aggressive. But yes, in general, I would say that if you had to rate on a scale of 1 to 10, when you're in slick, calm conditions with no wind, the bass in the grass might be a 3 out of 10 or 4 out of 10 on the aggression scale, where a bass without the grass might be a 1 or 2 out of 10 on the aggression scale. So it's not a huge deal. But then if you get wind and clouds and rain, these fish might get to a 9, and then these grass fish are also at a 9. So it doesn't really matter that much. Hopefully that makes sense. How does this affect the bluegill? Don't have shad on my lakes. So yeah, Matt, with the bluegill, basically, and remember, this was the seminar for the lakes with shad or some sort of herring. So if there's, I'm not going to cover that too much because that was specified when we signed up. This was just a seminar just for the shad lakes. But in general, with the grass is going to hold those bluegill up in the spawn. The bluegill will spawn up here. It's kind of a whole other deal. It would take me another probably 30 minutes to explain all of that. So I'm going to hold off on that. I'll be doing a seminar on natural lakes where there's lakes without shad, with just perch and stuff like that, at a later date. So that kind of changes up completely when there's no shad in the lake. Let's see here. Yeah, and then there's Brand says so you can have both of these on the same lake, a big lake. Yes, yeah, like on Sam Rayburn Lake, sometimes you'll find that there's a bunch of grass on the northern end and not much grass on the southern end. And then same thing like on Lake Washita in Arkansas, there's a lot of grass on the lower end, not grass on the upper end. So you can kind of pick and choose. In general, what I find is it's easier to find fish on lakes without grass because you can use your electronics to find them, especially offshore. But there's a healthier population of fish in areas with grass because the shad can grow up better. And usually whenever there's grass in the lake, there's more and bigger fish in that lake. So kind of give or take there. Okay, I think I covered that pretty thoroughly. Don't want to get too lost in the weeds there. So let's jump to key factors to consider. Number 2, we talk about lake conditions, got that all covered. Next, let's talk about weather. I know that was the name of the seminar, how weather affects bass, but hopefully the lake condition stuff was helpful as well. I think it all ties together, so I want to make sure I covered it all. So let's talk about weather. We're going to start with air temperature. Air temperature is kind of another overrated factor. A lot of guys really get caught up about air temperature, and water temperature and air temperature are linked, obviously. When you have warmer air temperatures, you get warmer water temperatures. And we've already talked about the fact that water temperature is overrated, so air temperature is even more overrated. I don't put a lot of weight into air temperature at all. Really, it doesn't really affect me. I don't really care what the air temperature is. I worry more about the water temperature and then the associated conditions that come with changes in air temperature, like fronts, sky conditions, stuff like that. But there is one thing that air temperature does have a big impact on, and that is when we were talking about this cooling water effect. In the early fall, you'll have, when that water temperature at 70 degrees, you'll have a turnover in your lakes. So the thermocline starts to disappear. And when the thermocline begins to disappear on the main lake, this is a direct result of your change in air temperature. So your air temperature, really the one time it actually makes a really big difference is during that fall period. And you want to really keep track of your air temperature really, really carefully in the fall time. It can be somewhat of a factor in the spring with the spawn, but again, the water level and the current flow and stuff, really the water level will trump water temperature and air temperature in the spawn. If the water is fluctuating, water temp doesn't matter. But in the fall, air temperature is the most important thing due to the thermocline. So let me explain what the thermocline is, and we'll kind of get into that. Where are we? I don't think we're that far down. There we go. Okay, the thermocline. So the thermocline, for those of you who have maybe are a little bit unfamiliar, is basically where you have a mixing of two different types of water. So the thermocline is created where you have, because you have a stratification, which basically means a difference between warm oxygenated water and then colder, less oxygenated water. The reason you have warm oxygenated water at the top of the lake is because, one, warm water rises, just like warm air rises. So warm water is going to rise to the top of the lake. At the same time, in the summer, when you have really warm water temperatures and that water starts to hit, or that air temperature and water temperature starts to hit the 75-degree range. This is probably thermocline starts to form. I think that's what I had in here initially, and then I didn't finish this, but usually the thermocline starts to form when that water temperature hits 75 degrees, give or take. Sometimes it can happen a little bit when it's a little bit cooler than that, but 75 is kind of a good threshold for that thermocline. And when that water temperature starts to rise, or the air temperature starts to rise, let's say in the summer when you have nights that are in the 60s and 70s, your highs are in the 80s or 90s, especially down south, that warm air is going to warm up the water temperature a lot. And you'll get that water temperature in the 75, 80 degree range. All that warm water then will stay at the top of the surface. And because that water is staying at the top of the surface, it's going to interact with the air. And that water interacting with the air gives it more oxygen. So you'll have warm oxygenated water staying at the top. Lots of oxygen, warm. And then as you go further down to the lake, basically the water starts to cool down because it's not exposed to as much sunlight, and it's not exposed to as much air because that colder water will sink, keeping it further away from the oxygen. So you'll have cold, less oxygenated water. And there's a point called the thermocline where basically the oxygen levels in the lake get so low that you literally cannot have fish survive below that level. This is basically like outer space where there's no oxygen. Those bait fish and those bass cannot breathe and they're going to die. Now, this thermocline sets in, and this allows us to determine where the fish are going to be a lot of times in the summer. The thermocline really only happens during the summer when you have really warm air temperatures, warm water temperatures. And if we go back to our graphic about the ultra clear water, you'll see in the summer that your thermocline will be set up and you can actually determine how deep to fish based on where that thermocline is. And the thermocline actually will extend all the way across. That didn't do what I wanted to do. That thermocline will extend all the way across, and that thermocline can be even set up in other water clarities. So sometimes that thermocline can be in 15 feet, even when that water visibility is 4 to 5 feet of visibility. So even though that plankton should grow down to 25 feet of water, what happens is that thermocline set up right here. So even though plankton's growing down here, the bait fish can't feed down here. It's not feasible for them to feed down here that deep because there's no oxygen. So they have to feed above the thermocline. So even though the water has 4 to 5 feet of visibility, if that thermocline is in 15 feet, they have to feed up here in 15 feet of water. Otherwise, they will literally die. So to kind of go back to our graphic over here, that thermocline is going to show up, where are we? Here. It's going to show up where that water level, those water types mix. And once you kind of get to a certain point or a certain depth, the thermocline will appear. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second. And I'm going to pull up a graphic. For those of you who haven't seen this before, I want to show you that you can actually find your thermocline on your fish finder. So let me open this up and then pause that. Give me a second here. I need to share my screen, share that. And then let me know if you can see the sonar image in the Q&A, guys, if you could. Let me know if you can see this sonar, this down imaging image. Yeah, okay, awesome. So basically, if you go on down imaging and you drive out in a deep part of the lake, so like, for example, this might be 70 or 80 feet of water. Find the deepest part of your lake and then crank your sensitivity up on your fish finder. If you crank that sensitivity up, you'll actually be able to see your thermocline really clearly, that band of water right there. The water above this line is the warm oxygenated water. Water below this line is your less oxygenated cold water. You can see actually here all this little bait fish and particles and stuff in the water. Those are all of your bait fish and fish, and they're set up above that thermocline line. Now this thermocline can be different throughout your lake. So you might find that on the lower end, the thermocline is in 25 feet of water. On the upper end, it's in 10 foot of water. Or maybe in the back of a creek, the thermocline might be in 15 feet of water. And on the main lake, the thermocline could be in 30 feet of water. So your thermocline will be different depending on where you are in your lake. So let me pull back up this screen here. So for example, if we go to our first example of this creek, you might find that your thermocline out or back in the back of this creek in the summer, this thermocline right here might be in, it might be 15 feet, but the thermocline out here is in 25 feet, or vice versa. If there's a lot of current on your main part of your lake, the current will actually mix that water more and cause the thermocline to not set up as well. So you might not have a thermocline on the main lake, but you may have a good thermocline in the back of the creeks because there's less current affecting the water. Basically what current does in a lot of winds, it will mix the water up and cause the thermocline to not really appear because that cold water and warm water will mix due to the current flow. So current can affect your thermocline as well. Basically, that air temperature then is going to be really important because as you get into the fall and that water temperature starts to drop from 75, 80 degrees down to the 70-degree range, you're going to have some cooler nights. And the reason that water temperature starts to fall is because you have some cool nights during the fall. Those cooler nights, let's say 30, 40-degree nights, maybe 20-degree nights, if you get like a really bad cold front, will start dropping the water temperature at the top of the lake. What happens then is at some point, that water at the top of the lake becomes colder than the water at the bottom of the lake. This means that the warm water is at the bottom of the lake, the cool water is at the top of the lake, therefore all the warm water rises and mixes, and it causes a whole like mixing effect. This is bad because all this low oxygen water now mixes with the high oxygen water. And basically the water column now is a mixture of low oxygen and high oxygen. It's basically like if you walked out your front door and you could breathe 1 second, and then the next second you can't breathe at all. And you're like gasping for air. And then you walk 10 more feet and you can breathe again. Then you walk 10 more feet, you can't breathe. That's what happens to the fish. They get really, really screwed up because the thermocline is gone and that water oxygen levels are all messed up. So what we talked about earlier with the shad movement and stuff like that is that in the fall, a lot of these shad and these bait fish are out here in the mouths of these creeks, maybe out in the main lake, and that's where the bass are in the summer. But as that thermocline starts to evaporate, all this water starts mixing oxygen levels, and it's really uncomfortable for the fish and the bass, or from the bait fish and the bass. So what'll happen is those bait fish will start migrating back into the back of these creeks as that water temperature starts to fall to the 70-degree mark. Even it happens like when water temperatures are even like 75 sometimes, they'll start that move. And it's kind of a gradual move. They're not going to make this move like overnight. As soon as you get that first cold front of the year, though, that's usually, even if you get a cold front and it's like 50 degrees at night and it's 70 or 80 degrees during the day, and then for 2 more weeks again it's warm, those bait fish saw that first initial drop in water or in air temperature, and they start making their push and they start pushing back in. So you might find in September, even though some days it's 100 degrees still, other days you might have 50-degree nights. And so those bait fish will start making their move back in these creeks because they want to stay ahead of that thermocline evaporating. Basically, the reason they're trying to get to the back of these creeks before the thermocline evaporates is that as you get further back in these creeks, you get shallower and shallower water. So out here, your water might be 30 feet of water, and the thermocline might set up in 15 feet. However, back in this pocket, the deepest water in this whole area is 15 feet, back in the back of a creek or back in the back of a cove. So back in here, it's 10, 15 feet of water. Well, if the thermocline is in 15 feet out here, and you have 15 feet of water here, it means there was never a thermocline that's set up in the back of this creek. There's no thermocline at all. What this means then is that these bait fish can move back in here and the oxygen levels will be stable in the backs of the creeks when they're all screwed up on the main lake. That's what causes those bait fish, when the water temperatures start to fall, to push to the back of the creeks, and that's what causes the bass to move with them. If you ever wondered by the bait fish moving to the backs of the creeks, there you go. So yeah, that's pretty much the thermocline in a nutshell. Let's see here. Gary says the thermocline on our lake is pretty consistently starting at 22, 23 feet in the summer, but it's common to graph bait as far down as 40 feet or more. Have you seen this before? I've seen this when the thermocline isn't like really set up strong. So there's times when that thermocline is like, if there's a lot of current flow and like a lot of movement in the water, the bait fish can go deeper. Sometimes they're not actually bait fish though. Sometimes you're graphing like catfish and other stuff that are more resilient. Usually that bait fish doesn't go below the thermocline, or maybe you just found them at that moment, but I don't know, maybe the thermocline's starting to dissipate a little bit. But yeah, I've seen it happen at times, but it's not common if the thermocline is like really set in, and definitely the bass and the bait fish won't feed below the thermocline for sure, consistently. So that's at least what I've seen. Okay. So, talked about air temperature. Next, let's talk about sky conditions. So sky conditions basically is going to be when you have cloudy skies. Let's see here. So when you have sunny skies, you have cloudy skies, or maybe you have rain and thunderstorms. What do I have here? This is low night temps. That was what I was explaining. I had a graphic there ready for me, and I was pulling up all this other stuff. Anyways, cool. So sky conditions are sunny. So basically with your sky conditions, what you'll find is that when it's really, really sunny outside, the bass are going to act a lot differently than when you have clouds and when you have rain thunderstorms. This seems like common sense probably to a lot of you guys, but I do want to go through it just to explain. So in general, what you'll find is when you have sunny skies, the bass are going to position tighter to cover and tighter to shade. Cover could be a brush pile, it could be a lay down log, it could be grass, it could be anything that casts a shadow, a boat dock, anything like that. And this happens both in shallow water and deep water. So not only will you find the bass will set up around the shade, around shallow cover like this with the shade, they'll also set up on brush piles in deeper water and use that shade. And what you'll find is that when you have those sunny skies, getting around any sort of shade is the best thing you can do. And you want to really be particular about this, because when it's sunny, I never make a cast on any area that doesn't have shade in it, whether it's offshore with a brush pile or shallow with a shallow tree. If it's sunny out, I'm not just randomly casting down a rocky bank or randomly fishing riprap or whatever. I'm finding areas where there's going to be shade available for those bass. That is super, super key. Now, you want shade a lot of times in the sense of you want sun hitting an object and then producing shade. It's not always the best when you have like a fully shaded bank or whatever in the middle of the day. Sometimes it can be good when you're up shallow, but a lot of times it's even better if you have some object that's getting direct sunlight hitting it and then producing the shade, because it makes the bass very predictable in where they're setting up. They're going to set up right in that shade line. The reason they use that shade line is because they can use it to ambush bait fish. If bait fish decide to move in to feed, the bass can jump out of the shade and use it to ambush the bass. The shade becomes their ambush point. And a lot of times when you talk about cover, the reason that bass are setting up around like an offshore brush pile, for example, is not because they actually care about the brush pile. What the brush pile does for them is two things. One, it gives them shade to ambush any bait fish that come by. And the brush pile is a good source of plankton for the bait fish to feed on. So the bait fish feed on the plankton, which grows on the brush pile. The bass use the shade of the brush pile to ambush the bait fish. The bass don't necessarily live in the brush pile because they like the brush pile. It's a tool to ambush bait fish, and it's also where the bait fish feeds. So this is kind of like setting up a McDonald's restaurant. You know those customers that are going to be coming, so you set up the McDonald's, you put some good food there, and you just wait for the customers to come in and start eating, and then you take their money. And that's kind of how that works. That's what the bass are doing with the brush piles. That was kind of a weird example, but hopefully that makes sense. Now, on cloudy conditions, it's a little bit different. So when there's clouds and no sun in the sky, just clouds, there's not as much of an incentive for those bass to set up around the brush pile, because it doesn't give the bass anything to ambush the bait fish on. The bait fish, basically, they might swim and still eat on this brush, but those bass, there's no shade or shadows for them to hide in. So they basically just have no incentive to sit and set around the brush pile all day. Instead, what they'll do is they'll kind of just roam around. They'll roam from one brush pile to another, or roam in different areas and kind of spread out a little bit more. So if we kind of look at a situation here, we have these cloudy skies, you might find that, actually, let me grab a different example. I need to find a bass, solo bass, there we go. You might find in these cloudy conditions that these bass are not going to group up anywhere. They might just spread themselves out over an area. They might be a bass over here, a bass over here, maybe a bass up shallow, and they're just going to kind of spread around and wait for those bait fish to come by. And those bait fish are going to still swim around and be feeding on the rocks and the brush and the grass, but they don't really have an ambush point. So the bass just kind of swim around and just hope to intercept the bait fish as the bait fish swim around. However, when you have cloudy skies, those bass will get really tight to brush and they'll wait to ambush, because there's it's a lot easier for them to ambush those bait fish and eat them when there's shade on an object. Now, the one thing about the cloud cover, though, is that usually those darker conditions are going to make the bass more aggressive. Why is that? Well, basically, when you have cloudy skies, those bass can't see the bait fish nearly as well. What this means is that, for example, let's say you were going back to the swimming pool I talked about earlier. You stick your head in that Olympic swimming pool. It's indoors and it's bright, and it's the bright lights are on. Someone has the lights on in the pool gym. Well, when you stick your head in that pool and it's clear water, you can see all the way across the pool. The lights are on. It's great. But as soon as you turn the lights off, your visibility gets cut in half or by a third. You can't see nearly as far across that pool because there's no light to help you see across the water. Same thing happens in these cloudy conditions. It makes it hard for those bass to see the bait fish. So what the bass are basically doing then is they're just swimming around hoping they find some bait fish. They kind of roam and spread out more. And then when something comes by that's moving, they just eat it. They're more aggressive because they can't get a good look at your bait as well. They don't know if it's bait fish, they don't know if it's whatever. They just know it's moving, so they eat it. So usually those bass are easier to trick with like a moving bait, a spinner bait, a crankbait, things like that in these cloudy conditions because they don't have as good a visibility. They can't see your bait as well. But on the flip side, when you have bright bluebird skies, it's a lot harder to get these fish to bite because when they can actually see your bait coming, they can see the shad clearly, the sun's out, they can see everything that's going on. So it's trickier to get these fish to bite on sunny conditions because they are more observant of your bait. But they're in a better ambush position. So even though there's disadvantages to having sun in that the bass can see your bait better, there are advantages because it groups the fish up in single areas better. So what I'll do is in this situation, I can catch a lot of good fish and catch good numbers fishing brush piles or shallow wood or whatever with a soft plastic bait, a shaky head, flipping a creature bait, stuff like that. Something that's more finessey, that's kind of like the Kit Kat bar, and I can get a lot of bites on this. At the same time, on those cloudy days, I can get bites in a reaction bait, and the reaction bait allows me to cover more water. So I can throw a spinner bait, a crankbait, a chatterbait, and I can make a lot more casts in the day and kind of cover a vast amount of water and pick off these fish with a moving bait. So really, there's not a good or a bad time to go fishing in these conditions. It's just when it's cloudy, I'm throwing a moving bait and I'm covering water. When it's sunny, I'm picking up a slow bottom bouncing bait like a jig or a shaky head, and I'm going to isolated targets with shade, and I'm going to make specific casts. And I'm only going to make probably a third of the casts I will with a shaky head than I will with a crankbait. But all of those, let's say I make 200 to 300 casts a day with the shaky head, they're all going to be in really productive water. Or with that chatterbait, I might make 1,000 casts a day, and I'm not going to be around as many groups of fish, but I'll have my bait in the water more often, and those bass are more aggressive, so I'll usually get equal or comparable number of bites. Hopefully that all makes sense. Does water temp matter on sunny days? Water temp doesn't really matter usually. It doesn't really make a difference. The sun and the clouds are kind of a separate entity. It kind of works all together, Brandon, but it's not like a big deciding factor. You just have to kind of take it into account a little bit. And then got Robert. Robert, you're raising your hand. Drop your question, Robert, over in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. That's where I'm seeing all the questions is in the Q&A function. Just drop your question there. Let's see here. Okay. And then John's question for general rule of bass being in cover, shade when it's sunny, and then they roam more in cloudy. Is this true with both largemouth and smallmouth? Yes, it's true with both largemouth and smallmouth. They'll roam more. Both will roam more, and then when it's sunnier, they'll get tighter to objects, rocks, things like that. So yeah, pretty universal in that. Okay, and then the last condition is your rain, your thunderstorms. Now, rain and thunderstorms are tricky because rain is going to be a little bit interesting because when you have a lot of rain, the rain I find doesn't really affect the fishing that much other than bringing in new water into the lake, and then it has clouds. So the rain doesn't really matter. Really, it's just you have the cloud cover. So when you have cloud cover and then you have rain, the clouds and the low light conditions matter a lot more than the rain itself. What does mess up the fish, though, are thunderstorms. Thunderstorms are terrible when you're fishing, especially in a tournament and stuff like that, because whenever you start getting thunder, those bass get really skittish in shallow water. And whenever you get a strong thunderstorm, those bass up in shallow water will not be as aggressive. It makes them a lot less aggressive. You're not going to have as many fish biting topwater baits, for example. There's always this misconception like, hey, throw a topwater in the rain. Well, yeah, throwing topwater in the rain is fine, but also throwing a topwater during cloud cover is also really good. But never throw a topwater when there's thunderstorms. That thunderstorm will cause those fish to not want to get up shallow and actually pushes those fish a little bit deeper, or they just hunker down the bottom and are inactive. So what I find is that whenever there's thunderstorms, and I don't recommend fishing during a thunderstorm, but even like an hour or two after a thunderstorm rolls through, don't try to fish up shallow or as shallow as you were during or right after a thunderstorm. I actually find that I catch a lot more fish offshore right after thunderstorms because those fish are not as affected by it because they're in deeper water. So in thunderstorm conditions, right after the thunderstorm, if you take shelter and then get back off from the thunderstorm, go fish offshore for a bit. Don't return shallow because that will kill a shallow water bite. The thunderstorms will really fast. Now I'm talking about like real like lightning, thunder, stuff like that. If it's just raining and there's no thunder or lightning, then those fish will keep biting. And also, it doesn't matter if there's like thunder like miles away. It's like if there's thunder over the top of your spot, that's what affects those fish. Kyle's asking a question about follow up on John's question. Is this the same for grass and grass lakes? Yes. So same exact thing with the grass and grass lakes with the cloud cover. When you have sunny conditions, those bass will get tighter into the grass and they'll set up in like the thickest, shadiest grass you can find, the thickest grass mats, the thickest clumps of grass, and you catch them a lot more on like your slow moving baits or your slow baits like a jig, flipping, stuff like that. But then when you get a bunch of cloud cover and wind, those fish will get a little more aggressive. They'll kind of pop out of the grass a little bit more and roam a little bit more in the grass, like kind of expand their strike zone. And you'll be able to catch them on moving baits like a chatter bait or a spinner bait or like a swim jig. But really what you'll find is that the strike zone for those grass fish when it's sunny might be the size of the front deck of your boat. Then maybe the size of the strike zone for the bass when you have cloudy conditions, maybe it's now the size of your entire boat. So it expands from being a 10-foot strike zone to a 20-foot strike zone. It's not a massive difference in the grass, but it is a difference. And those fish are a little bit easier to catch on moving baits in the cloud cover. And then again, in the sun, fish the slow moving baits. So that was that. What about time of year, like early spring? Sun and clouds, I would say take your sun and clouds. These rules of thumb apply in every season of the year. So when you were looking at these factors here, guys, these like water temperature, water clear, all this stuff, they all interact together, but they're all independent factors. So for example, if you're looking at season of the year and then you have your sky conditions, a sunny day will affect the fish the same in the spring, winter, fall, doesn't really matter. Air temperatures just have an impact in certain specific times. Water level, it can affect fish in all different seasons. So all these factors are happening all at once. So you kind of have to take it all in at once. But in general, your sky conditions are an independent factor that they will affect the fish the same regardless of what everything else is doing. The sky conditions will cause those fish as a uniform effect on those bass behavior, if that makes sense. Okay, that was that. Cool. And then that's basically it for the sky conditions. We're going to talk about a little bit more here in just a second, but that is our sky conditions. Next up, I want to talk about fronts. Now we're kind of running a little bit low on time here. So I'm going to skip fronts for a second. We're going to come back because we're going to have our break here in about 8 minutes. And then I'm going to skip to moon phase just for a minute. Then I'll talk about the fronts and the time of day and then the other factors. So the fronts are going to take a while to explain, and I'll make sure I have plenty of time without interruptions on that. So I'm going to skip to the moon phase and then obviously keep dropping your questions in there, and I'll respond to them after I come back from the break. So moon phase is kind of interesting. A lot of guys pay a lot of attention to moon phase. I don't really pay that much attention to moon phase. There are exceptions to that, but I'm not one of those guys who has the moon phases on my phone and then study it religiously. I've done that in the past. I haven't seen it made that much of a difference. I see the other factors override the moon phase a lot more. Like I've seen that I've tried to really key in on what the moon phase is and determine what's happening there, and all the other factors override it. I find that the water level and the water temperature and the water clarity and all these other factors are more important than the moon phase. But the moon phase can tell us a few things about the bites that is kind of interesting. Let's go back over here. So basically the thing that I'm most important, or that I feel like is the most important, is the new moon and the full moon. That's really the most important thing for me. Obviously, when you have this waning gibbous and waxing gibbous, so basically you have the almost full moon, that is also pretty important. But the new moon and the full moon also, basically when the moon is a half moon, this quarter moon, I don't really have too much strong opinion on that. But it's the new moon and the full moon are then right on these lines where you have mostly a moon that affects the fish. The first way it affects the fish is that whenever you have a new moon, it's going to have a lot less light during the nighttime. What you'll find is that during the night, you'll have a lot of feeding activity whenever there is a full moon. The reason for this is because there's just enough light from a full moon to allow the baitfish to see what's on the bottom of the lake and see the plankton, but there's not enough light from a full moon to let the bass get a good look at the baitfish. I would coordinate a full moon in the middle of the night with having a pretty cloudy sky in the middle of the day. So like heavy cloud cover in the middle of the day is basically the same as having a full moon in the middle of the night. What this means is that it makes those fish a little more aggressive. It makes the bait fish move up and feed more often. And when you have that full moon, again, there's just enough light where the bait fish can feed effectively, but not enough light where the bass can see what's going on very well. So those bait fish have an advantage in their feeding, and usually the bait fish feed heavily at night, which causes the bass to be aggressive and the bass feed up really well. What this also means is that a lot of the fish feed in the middle of the night during a full moon. And then when you get to the lake, there's usually a really good morning bite and a really good bite right before dark. But then the middle of the day bite is really tough. So whenever I go out to the lake whenever I go fishing and I look up at the sky the night before and I see there's a full moon, I'm like, man, I need to get to the lake early today because the best bite is going to be in the first hour of the morning. Basically the end of that morning bite, or the end of that night bite. The first hour of the morning basically is like the last hour of the night bite. And that night bite's going to be really good when you have a full moon. And then if I see a full moon that's still up in the sky after like 7 or 8 o'clock, and I know there's been a full moon the night before, and I'm fishing in the middle of the day, I know those fish are going to be really full, and I'm not going to pick up my moving baits as much. I'm going to pick up my slower moving baits, like a shaky head, a jig, and really just fish methodically and fish slow. And basically, those fish are going to be needing a Kit Kat bar all day. They're going to feed up all night long, and they're not going to be very aggressive during the day. So I'm going to really focus on my finesse approaches whenever I'm fishing during the daytime of a full moon. Now, the opposite is the case when you have a new moon. During the new moon, there's like basically it's pitch black in the middle of the night, and those bait fish can't see what's going on at all. So they don't really feed that much at night. Instead, they'll feed a lot during the day. So you'll find that the fish are going to be more aggressive and they're going to be feeding better during a new moon, at least from what I've seen. And you can usually get a pretty good bite first hour of the morning as well, because that's the first chance those bait fish really have to feed. But they'll also feed up a little bit better and be a little more aggressive during the day. Now, this isn't like, I'm not talking about like, this is not the end all be all, because if you have really strong front that moves through, currents, wind, that will override the moon all the time. So like if you have a situation where there's a feeding window where that current is flowing at noon every single day, it doesn't matter if you have a full moon or a new moon that night. If that current starts flowing in the middle of the day at like noon and really starts kicking on, those fish will feed with that current. Or if you have a front that starts pushing through, those fish will feed with that front, and the bait fish will feed with the front, even though there was a full moon or the night before there wasn't a moon. So this is just kind of a general, like I kind of keep it in the back of my head, but I don't let it dictate my fishing day. It's something where I'm like, okay, if it's a full moon during the day, I'm going to not be as quick to pick up the moving baits. I'm going to go to some of the slower moving baits unless there's really ideal conditions. There's wind, cloud cover, current flow, stuff like that. The other thing the moon phase affects is basically when the bluegill spawn, or the panfish. This is the same thing with perch, bluegill, stuff like that. In the summertime, the bluegill will spawn during a full moon and a new moon. Every full moon and every new moon throughout the entire summer, a wave of bluegill will move in to spawn up shallow. What this does is keeps a lot of bass up shallow throughout the summertime, and you'll usually find that there'll be a good shallow water bite up in like pockets and coves where the brim are actually getting on their beds. And you can find the brim bedding in these shallow pockets and coves. And every full moon and new moon, there's a new wave that moves in, which replenishes a food source for the bass, and the bass get pretty aggressive. And I find that it's usually better on the full moon. The spawn's a little bit better, but it's not that big of a difference. But basically, if I'm going to go fish up shallow in the summertime, I'm going to be fishing right around the new moon or right around the full moon, because that's when those bluegill reload and those bass get really, really aggressive. I don't fish that much up up shallow in the summertime, like ever. So I am not an expert on that. So I'm not like super well versed in the moon phase, but that's at least what I pay attention to. And there's probably a lot more to this that I don't know, and that you guys probably know more than I do. But put it this way, I don't pay attention to it. It doesn't affect me. I don't see that I'm missing anything big, and I've studied it and looked at it, and I don't think it has this massive effect that overrides all the other effects we talked about. Put it that way. It can have an effect, but all these other factors have a much larger effect. It's something to take into account within the whole equation, but it would be the last thing I take into account over all these other factors, maybe air temperature. But yeah, so that is that. So if we go to the time of day and the fronts, we'll do that after we get back. So let me know. And Kyle asked, have you seen a poor? Oh, yeah. Okay, I got your question answered. Awesome. So yeah, leave any more comments or questions you guys have. Also, let me know how it's all going so far. If there's anything you need to give more detail, speed up, slow down. Any feedback is always appreciated. Again, since I can't see you guys all. I can't see you guys all in person or whatever. So just give me any feedback you can, and also leave any questions. And I'll be coming back from break here in 10 minutes, and we'll jump back. Let me stop sharing so you can see my face. There we go. There we go. So yeah, let me know if you have any questions. I'll answer those as we come back from break. And just give me 10 minutes, just refill some water, and just take a quick break, and we'll be back in 10 minutes. See you in a second. Okay, I am back. Hopefully everyone is still here. Timothy says, this is great information. This is what I've been wanting to learn, but I couldn't get anyone to talk about it, honestly. Thank you. No problem, Timothy. That's what we're here for. And then James asks, what determines when the first bite on different parts of the lake? What determines when fish bite on different parts of the lake at different times of the day? The big thing there, James, is really just a matter of when you go to a different section of the lake, you're going to deal with different water clarities. And so with different water clarities, you're going to have fish biting at different depths, which then determines if they're biting shallow or offshore. But usually it doesn't really make a difference on what part of the lake you're on. If you actually watch Major League Fishing, if you watch like the score tracker on there, which is really cool, when fish start biting on one part of the lake, they bite everywhere. Like the entire score tracker starts lighting up. So guys are catching fish all at the same time, regardless of whether they're fishing shallow or offshore. So the fish will just start biting due to all the weather conditions, the stuff we're about to talk about, the fronts, which is really important. That will cause those fish to start biting in all water depth, water clarities, and sections of the lake. There's just feeding windows throughout the day that are consistent regardless of the type or style of fishing you're doing. At that point, then it's just a matter of, are you in the best area with the most fish or the biggest fish, or can you catch those fish? That's kind of how that works. Let's see here. And then Joshua says, great stuff, but you just scared the crap out of my dog. Oh no, I don't know what I did there. Hopefully I didn't cause any issues there. And then Gary says he wants to check out Raystown Lake in Pennsylvania. It sounds like I need to head to Pennsylvania. There's a lot of guys who are followers of the channel from Pennsylvania. So that might be a trip I need to make one day just to check out some of those lakes, some of those tricky lakes over there. So cool. Well, let's jump right back into it. Oh, we got a question from Robert over in the chat. Why do bass come out 20 plus feet of water hit top water in a lake like Lanier on normal type of brush, but my neighborhood Clearwater Lake with herring like Hartwell, it's reduced around 10 feet or less, and having to use more cane pile brush. So with that, I'm not actually sure, Robert, the reasoning there. That's beyond my my understanding, unfortunately. The fact that is the case is interesting, actually. I didn't know that about Lanier and the difference. I know about the cane pile stuff and all that, but didn't know there was that big of a difference there. So that's interesting. I didn't know that. So I'm not 100% sure, unfortunately. It might just be water visibility. It might be the strain of spotted bass. There's a bunch of stuff that it could be. Let's start sharing my screen and we'll jump into it. Okay, get that pulled up. Good to go. Okay, let me know if you guys can see my screen again. I want to make sure I'm actually sharing before I start talking. That's something that I do all the time, is not have my screen shared. So got it. Okay, thanks, Thomas. Cool. So let's jump over to the last two weather factors, fronts and time of day, and then we'll also talk about the other factors, which shouldn't take too long. Fronts is going to take a while. So we'll get into that, and that's something that you guys are going to like. Now, I put up another graphic for this, so hopefully you guys will enjoy this. This is one of the things that's going to come with the packet of charts and things I give you. So this is basically fronts, conditions in each stage. So a front basically is when you have low pressure or high pressure changes. So the barometric pressure changes. And I'm not a big proponent of barometric pressure because I find that it confuses people more than helps people. So what I focus on is more the conditions ahead of the front, because the barometric pressure itself doesn't actually matter. If you have high barometric pressure, low barometric pressure, that doesn't affect the fish. What affects the fish are the resulting weather and lake conditions that happen due to the barometric pressure changing. So for example, pre-front conditions, you're going to have a certain barometric pressure. It doesn't really matter. You're going to have a barometric pressure at a certain level. That's going to generate wind, cloud cover, and potentially some rain. This will then cause the bass to become more aggressive and usually cause them to move shallower. Now, shallower is relative. Usually if you're fishing, let's say offshore and 25 feet of water, maybe those bass start moving up into the 15-foot of water range because the bait fish starts to move shallower as you get more wind and the cloud cover. It stirs up the water, makes the water a little bit, or makes it harder for the bait fish to see. So the bait fish move a little bit shallower where they get more sunlight, and that causes the bass to become more aggressive. The wind and the clouds make it hard for them to see, make them more likely to eat a moving bait. And the barometric pressure causes these weather changes. Then as the front starts to roll through, this is usually when you actually get the rain and the clouds. So the pre-front is right before the rain and the thunderstorms come through. Then as the front's rolling through, usually you'll have really heavy winds right before the front, pre-front. And then as the front's actually there, you'll have very intense storms for the first 5-10 minutes. Then most of the front, you're just gonna have light winds, cloud cover, maybe some lightning, maybe some thunder, maybe some heavy rains, depends. And in this situation, the bass are going to be a little more timid and they're actually going to move deeper, especially if you have that lightning. I've talked about that earlier. The bass seem to move a little bit further off the bank. They don't like to get up there shallow and need top water or moving baits as much. They get a little bit more timid, and it's usually better to fish a little bit further off the bank actually during a front, like right when the front is going through, the actual front. Pre-front, those bass are shallower. During the front, they move deeper. Then and they move deeper, but they don't necessarily group up. They just kind of all move just a little bit deeper. Then you have the immediate post front. The immediate post front, what I mean by that is it's like right after the front is done. So let's say you have a front that comes through, it's pre-front and front on a Saturday, or a Friday, maybe just the day before your tournament. So Friday is pre-front and the front rolls through Friday during the day and through the night. The next morning, you have the immediate post front, the day after the front or hours after the front. Usually this is accompanied by strong wind, partly sunny conditions. You have some clouds in the air, but the sun's popping out. And this is actually when the bass get really aggressive as well. So they were kind of timid during the front. They didn't really feed as much. And then because they kind of stopped feeding, they actually get really aggressive immediately after the post front. And that's something a lot of guys don't understand. The reason that a lot of guys don't think the fish feed very well in this immediate post front is because in the pre-front, let's say on Friday, they were hammering them in shallow water and they could catch them up shallow with a spinnerbait, a crankbait, stuff like that. However, in the post front, the immediate post front, the bass group up deeper. They'll actually move into deeper areas. They'll move a little bit off the bank, but they're still going to be very aggressive. So you can actually catch just as many fish pre-front as you can immediate post-front because you have that strong wind. That wind triggers those fish to feed, and also there's kind of a lull in the action during the actual front itself. So the best times to actually fish during a front are pre-front, which is usually going to be up shallower, and then the immediately after the front goes through, immediate post-front. That's going to be your two key feeding windows. A lot of people don't make that connection, and it's something a lot of guys miss. Then you get your traditional post-front conditions. So your post-front conditions are when you have no wind, bright bluebird skies. The fish are inactive and they get really tight to cover. The main reason that the post-front conditions are tough, again, barometric pressure is going to be a certain level, doesn't really matter. The reason it's tough though is there's no wind and there's bright sunny skies. What this basically means is that these bass can see the bait fish coming from a mile away. There's no wind to stir up the water, so it's basically just like a swimming pool in the middle of the lake. And those bait fish have no incentive to come up shallow and feed because it's really easy for the bass to see them, and they're basically sitting ducks. They're basically going to their demise. There's no way they're going to survive that trip. But when there's some wind, when there's some cloud cover, it protects them a little bit, makes them harder to see, and they can feed better. And as a result, the bass are going to be a little more inactive because there's no bait fish coming to them. They're just going to sit around and kind of just wait for bait fish to come by them. And they'll sit around some sort of cover with the sun, and they'll set up on brush piles or, lay down stuff like that. And so that is kind of how that works. And then finally, you have stable conditions. So stable conditions where you have variable wind and sun, and depends on the air conditions. When you have stable weather, the front doesn't really matter. The conditions can kind of change at will, and you kind of just have to adjust based on what we talked about earlier before. Now, one thing that I'm going to do is kind of go through all these conditions and show how this works and talk about a little bit in each season of the year, because the fronts affect the bass differently during the spring, like during the spawn period, also during the summer. Sometimes the fronts have more of an impact or less of an impact. So I kind of want to go through it all. Now, the times when these fronts have the most severe impact is usually during that spawning time of the year, spawning pre-spawn time of the year. What you'll find is that at this time of the year, you're going to have a lot of bait fish there setting up kind of on these secondary points, feeding up, maybe around some brush, and there's going to be a lot of bass that are staging up to spawn as well. Now, in pre-front conditions, a lot of times what happens is that these bait fish will move up shallower and they'll start feeding up on shallow rocks, shallow grass, whatever's up shallow, and those bass will move up there and feed on really heavily. This is usually when that water temperature is around 55 to 60 degrees, the pre-spawn. But what will happen is that there's going to be some bass that are also out here deeper. So you'll have kind of a splintering effect. You'll have some bass that are out here deeper that are feeding up from these pre-front conditions and bass up shallow. So you'll have both. And these pre-front conditions, as I've mentioned kind of earlier, it doesn't matter if you're fishing shallow or offshore. The bass will become more aggressive and will feed better offshore during the pre-front conditions, and they'll also feed better up shallow in the pre-front conditions. They'll feed better all over the lake, end to end, shallow or deep. As long as there's bass there, they're going to feed more. Now, let's say that you switch it up and we have the front that comes through. Usually what happens when that front is passing through is that those shad will kind of get back out, pull out of the grass. They kind of want to get away from the thunderstorm and all the heavy rain. And the bass get away from this shallow cover too, and they kind of just sit out here in limbo. I don't really know. I don't really like fishing during fronts that much. I actually don't fish during fronts that much just because with my filming and camera gear and stuff, it's hard to film during the rain. But I always remembered I hated fishing on days when it was just raining all day, because right after that storm kind of went through, the bite just got really tough. Those fish seem to suspend a lot on me as well during these conditions. They'll kind of just get suspended and just kind of just not really easy to catch. And then in this immediate post front, what happens is that these fish will really start to group up on any sort of offshore cover that's not deep, but that's offshore. So for example, these fish here, they were kind of in limbo zone, kind of in between the grass and this rock here. They're kind of in the limbo. But when you have that immediate post front, those fish will pull tight to some sort of rocky cover, rocky areas like this. And this happens even more drastically when those bass are actually spawning or getting ready to spawn. So let's say those bass are just about getting ready to spawn and you get these pre-front conditions that roll through. Let's say those bass were like a day away from spawning. Well, those bass will react to the front. They'll start feeding on the bait fish. But then if they were going to spawn the next day, and the next day you have these post-front conditions, that will push the fish off the spawning cycle, cause them to not spawn and actually group up on these areas here. These a little bit further off the bank. They'll actually stop spawning and they won't spawn again for 2 or 3 days. Now, if the water levels are stable and everything is solid, then usually after you get the post front and then you get the normal conditions, at some point they'll move back up. Once it stabilizes, 2-3 days later, they'll move back up and they'll keep spawning. but that front will knock those fish back off the beds and move, like if they're about to spawn. Now, if they're already on the bed spawning, they're going to keep spawning. It doesn't really matter. If they're up there and they're already committed and they've laid their eggs and stuff, they're up there. But if they're in that mode where like, oh, I'm about to spawn, and then the front rolls through, it will push them back. Now, let's say you're doing the same conditions in the fall. In the fall, what happens, the same thing. Usually those fish in the pre-front, they're going to move up. They're going to be actively feeding up in shallow water or in deeper water, wherever they are in the fall. Then what happens is that in this post-front condition, or during the front, those bass are just going to kind of be a little bit in limbo up shallow. But what you'll find is that those fish that are deeper will continue to feed pretty well. The cloud cover will help. The thunder and the rain doesn't really affect them that much. So you'll have the really decent bite still offshore. The shallow bite will get messed up during the front if there's no spawning or pre-spawn activity going on, just like a normal time of the year during the fall. Same thing kind of goes for the summer. It's kind of all the seasons except for around the spawn. That's the only time it's different. And then once you get this immediate post front, a lot of these fish that were up in the shallow water will pull back to just a little bit deeper water. Now, this is, I guess I said in all situations, it's not quite the case, because in the summer, those fronts don't drop the water temperature that much, don't drop the air temperature that much. So it doesn't really affect those fish as much. In the immediate post front, those fish might still be staying up shallower in the summer. So I would say in the summer, fronts have the least impact in terms of pushing fish away from areas. They'll kind of still stay in the same general areas. They'll just get a little bit tougher to catch. But in the winter or in the fall, especially when you get those like major cold fronts that comes through, and you know it's been 60-degree nights for a month, and all of a sudden you get a 30-degree night. That's when those fish will really push off the bank. And in the immediate post front, they'll group up on little rocky spots like this, and they'll feed aggressively on bait fish. You'll also have fish that are still in these offshore brush piles, still in these offshore areas, and they're still biting really well. And it's all good. And then as the post front rolls on, you'll have these bait fish and these bass kind of get into limbo again up shallower, especially in the fall, especially in the winter. But those fish that are offshore will still stay consistent. You'll still be able to get those fish to bite. And it might not be as easy to get them to bite, but they'll still kind of be grouped up. You have to slow down, fish your, this is not the immediate post front. This is just a straight up post front. There we go. Yeah, the immediate post front. The straight up post front. In this condition, you're going to have no wind. In the immediate post front, you have a lot of wind and you have the sun. So that will get those fish to aggressively feed offshore, and it'll get them to group up and aggressively feed in. I would say like this is like in between offshore areas. This would be like your 4 to 10 foot range. A lot of the fish will pull to 4 to 10 feet of water and feed pretty aggressively offshore, but not like deep offshore. And then you also still have an offshore bite. And then once you get that post front for real, those shallower water fish will get a little bit just weird. They'll kind of suspend and just not be great. Those offshore fish will get a little bit tricky to catch, but you can still usually catch them on a jig and a shaky head and stuff like that. In general, fronts affect the offshore fish the least. They still cause them to bite. When you have a pre-front, the offshore fish bite really well, but they will still bite in the post front pretty well also. The fronts don't affect the bass offshore nearly as much. That's why I like fishing offshore a lot, because they're more consistent when you can find them. The shallow fish get affected a lot more. Now, again, in the summer, fronts have a lot less impact. The fronts have the most impact. This whole cycle has the most impact right before the spawn and right as the bass are spawning. The second time it has the most impact is during the fall, when you have that first initial cool down, like September, October. It also has a pretty big impact in the spring when that water temperature is warming up. So kind of we go back to our ranges here, the fronts really affect those fish like right in this range, 58-degree water. Like that's when that front can really screw up a cycle. And it can really screw up these fish as well when that water's in that like 60 to 52 to 60 degree range, as well as even in the 70 degree. This range here, those fish can get kind of screwed up by that front. It kind of changes how they feed, if they feed shallow or deep. But when you get in this real winter period like this, the pre-front, post-front doesn't really bother them. Like when you get to the cold temperatures, and same thing in the summer here. When you're in the summer period here, it doesn't really affect them all that much. And it even doesn't really affect them that much in the post-spawn. Like once those fish are done spawning and they're in that post-spawn mood, it doesn't really affect the bass that much in general, the post-front conditions. It makes the bite tougher, but it doesn't move the fish as much, if that makes sense. So that's kind of the front stuff. I'm going to try to read some questions because I feel like I didn't explain that as well, but hopefully that all made sense. I feel like my level of focus is going down, guys. Sorry, when I talk for 3 hours straight, it's, my explanations are not as crisp and clean. So Ron had a question of, Kyle asked about the fronts, pre-spawn and full spawn periods. Hopefully I answered that question, Kyle. Will fronts move outside their beds? Hopefully I answered that question. Regarding the importance of shad, where you look for shad from 11 to 1 time period? I'll answer that question here in a second, Ron. That's a good question. Cool. I answered Kyle's question. Good deal. Awesome. So let me know if that all made sense, guys, over in the Q&A. If there's anything I need to clarify, if that all was clear. I feel like it was clear as mud, but hopefully that all made sense. Oh, shade, not shad, shade. Regarding the importance of shade, where do you look for shade from 11 to 1 time period? Usually I'm just looking for shallow laydowns, sub shallow, or then like brush piles. I fish offshore so much that usually I'm just looking for big objects that stick off the bottom, a brush pile, a rock pile. That's what I'm looking for. Up shallow, you could use a dock or whatever. There's a lot of places you can find shade, unless you are obviously in those cloudy conditions, then there won't be. Cool. Corey says he's understanding the fronts. Good. Cool. Good deal. Now let's jump to time of day. So time of day is the other factor that is a factor that plays into it, but it's not as big of a factor as you might think. Really, the big thing with time of day is that the time of day affects your light levels. So for example, when you're in the first hour of the morning, the last hour of the day, you'll find that your conditions are very similar to your cloudy skies. So when you have first hour of the morning, last hour of the day, there's a little bit of light that's peeking over the horizon, but there's not enough light where the bass can see what's going on very well. So the first hour of the morning usually triggers some sort of feeding period or feeding window, because those bait fish, they can see the plankton, see the brush and the cover pretty well because there's enough sunlight just peeking over the horizon, but it's not enough for the bass to see them very well. So there will be a pretty good feeding window, first hour of the morning, last hour of the day, because of the low light conditions. Then as the day progresses, there's usually going to be a midday lull. So in the middle of the day, from like 8 o'clock until 11 o'clock, usually that's when the bite gets kind of tough, because usually there's not going to be a lot of wind during that period. It's going to be kind of calm and maybe some sun or maybe some clouds, but not a lot of wind. And usually that's when the bite gets really kind of tough. The fish get a little bit inactive. The bait fish stop feeding. And usually there's a midday lull or that like mid-morning lull every fishing day you're ever going to fish. Then what you'll find is that as the day progresses, the sun gets up in the sky, it creates more shade around the cover, and it really positions those fish better, and also usually get more wind in the afternoon. The combination of the shade setting up better and the wind blowing more in the afternoon gets those bait fish to move up and gets those bass in position and makes them easier to catch. So usually for me, I find that in the mornings, it's pretty good to catch fish both shallow and offshore in the first hour of the morning. And there is a morning bite offshore. That's one thing a lot of guys don't know, but like offshore, there's a really good morning bite. Because of that low light conditions, it's not just a shallow deal. You don't just have to fish shallow in the morning. It's just usually there is also a good shallow bite. But I get a really good morning bite offshore as well. Guys just don't go fishing offshore in the morning. I don't really know why, but it affects the fish the same way, both shallow and offshore. Now, what happens is that as that sun gets up, things like that, it causes these bass to kind of spread out a little bit more and move. They might move a little bit deeper. They might move to a little bit deeper stretch of grass or a deeper area over here. And the bass offshore, they're sitting in the same place, but those shad move in to feed during the morning and they move out in that mid-morning period. And so these bass are basically just sitting, waiting for the next feeding window, the next feeding period. So at this point in the mid-morning, they're basically just sitting around waiting for more shad to come. So you need to catch them with a bait like a shaky head or like basically the Kit Kat bar example. Give them the Kit Kat bar. Then as the day progresses, the sun pops out more, creating more shade. The wind starts blowing. That will usually generate a second feeding window. The shad will move up to feed, both shallow and offshore, and you can get a really good bite going probably like noon to 3 o'clock is usually a pretty good time when that wind picks up and those fish start biting pretty well. The only time it doesn't really happen is when you have that post-front conditions, no wind, sunny skies. That's when it's just tough fishing. Then what you'll find is that As you get to later in the afternoon, there's kind of another lull from like 3 to 6 or 3 to 5. And then the last hour of the day, right before sunset, there's another feeding window. Right before sunset, and boom, those fish start biting again. The shad move in, and you can catch them really well. And then obviously at night, it depends on the moon phase. So if you have a full moon at night, the feed is pretty good. If you have a new moon at night, the feed window is not as good. And that's kind of what I know about the night fishing. I don't know a ton about night fishing. I don't really do it that much. But hopefully that kind of explains time of day. But the time of day can get thrown off completely depending on all the other factors we talked about: wind, current, cloud cover, rising water, current flow. You'll find, for example, like I fished a tournament one time on Lake Dardanelle that won this college regional championship. And I figured out that they were pulling current heavily at 10:30 every single morning. And that was normally during a lull in the action. Normally the bite on Dardanelle offshore in the summertime was really good first hour of the morning and then at like 2 o'clock in the afternoon. But for whatever reason, the week or 2 weeks I was fishing for this tournament, they were pulling current consistently at 10:30 during that lull, but that current flow triggered those bait fish to move up shallow on a shell bed and started feeding. And the only time those bait fish would move in and feed is from 10:30 to 11:30. You had to be on that shell bed at that exact point to get those fish to bite. And that's when the current flow played a really big factor, and it overrided the time of day element. Same thing with the wind, same thing with the fronts. It can override all these things. So that's something, again, I really want to stress, is that you have to take all of these factors in consideration and know that they're all happening at the same time. That's one of the things that's the hardest to figure out when you're fishing, is how do all these factors play together? And I can't really explain all of that perfectly in this seminar. I can't give you every single scenario. That's what I'm actually creating the app for. That's what the app is literally for, is for that, or how the factors change and shift and what you should be doing. So that's the app I'm making, and it should be pretty cool. But this is all really complicated because there's all these factors have a differing impact on what type of baits, whether you should fish offshore or shallow, where you should be fishing on sections of the lake, how it affects the spawn. All these different things can change up all these factors, and can be very daunting to understand. But what I'm trying to do is explain how each of these factors independently work kind of in a vacuum, how each independent factor works. Then you guys can go in and cross them together and hopefully bring it all full circle. That's what all these kind of handouts and stuff are going to be for. And you can kind of read through all of them, and hopefully then it all kind of clicks together. Now, couple more things that I want to talk about, and then I will have a few minutes for questions, hopefully. Let me see here. And Sean asks, how did you find that out? I don't know exactly what. How did you find that? Oh, there was a it was probably the current flow. The Corps of Engineers on Lake Dardanelle, they released their current release schedule, and I just looked at it, and you could actually see their historic. I found a website somehow. There's like certain lakes, certain websites all over the place. You kind of have to dig them up. Some lakes have apps, some lakes don't. You have to kind of look it up. But you can usually just go to your lake and type in like lake name and then current flow or current water level, and you'll be able to find out what levels of water they're releasing at different times. And normally there's not a future. You won't know what they're going to do in the future. You can at least see the past data. And if they did it for the last 3 or 4 or 5 days in a row, usually it's going to be consistent. And there's like the Corps of Engineers kind of where you can find that data. So last couple things I want to talk about are, we talked about that. Last things I want to talk about, a couple things: algae bloom, fishing pressure, pleasure boaters. So we're in the last stretch of these other factors. So one thing that's really overlooked that a lot of guys don't know about is the algae bloom. So algae bloom, basically algae, these little particles or microorganisms, whatever they are, that grow on the surface of the water. And whenever you get really warm water conditions, algae will start blooming on the surface of the water. And I don't know the exact science behind when this happens. I need to study it more. It's something I've been meaning to go in and take a deep dive on. I just haven't had the chance. But usually I find it happens in the summertime, especially on your more dirty water lakes. It can happen on some of your cleaner water lakes, but when you have dirtier water, what happens is the algae will start blooming up shallow on the surface of the water, and it'll usually bloom in shallower water as well. And that will push the bait fish up. And this happens a lot of times on river systems, dirtier water lakes. And for whatever reason, when you have bright, sunny skies and in the middle of the day, when the water temperatures are like 90 degrees, the algae will start blooming and it will push bait fish up into like 3, 4, 5 feet of water, like super shallow. And usually on these like dirtier water lakes, you'll catch fish offshore maybe 8 to 12 feet. And so you'll be catching like on brush piles out here. But then when that algae starts blooming in the middle of the day, those bait fish will push up into like 2 feet of water in the middle of the summer, but offshore, like way off on flats in different areas, and those bass will move up to feed on them. And that's actually how I won that college tournament, as well as I had the current fish, and I also was catching fish very late in the day on an algae bloom deal on some more shell beds and blew that tournament out of the water. I won by like 7 pounds for my 5 fish. And I actually did that a lot in a lot of my tournaments. I understood this algae bloom concept on a couple lakes in my area. I'm not an expert on exactly when it happens on every single lake. I don't know if there are that many experts on that. I need to probably read like scientific studies on it, which I don't really want to dig through a bunch of of that sort of stuff, of biologist stuff. I haven't had time to do that. But basically all I know is that during the summer, when it's dirtier water, really hot outside, the algae will bloom and the shad will move up really shallow and the bass will follow them. And you can usually get a really good bite on sandbars. This happens on like sandbars areas. You'll have a lot of shad to pull up. You'll have shallow ledges. Sometimes you can find this algae bloom even happens and you can find fish up pulling up in like shallow stump fields and stuff like that in the middle of the summer. And that's just because those shad move in there to feed on the algae. And I found it happen every once in a while. It's usually a summertime deal, hot water, middle of the day. So don't be afraid on your dirtier water lakes. I would say less than 3 foot of water visibility. In the middle of summer, go at like 2 o'clock in the afternoon and try to find shad that are pushed up into 2, 3, 4 feet of water on ledges, on points, things like that. You'll be surprised at how many fish you can find doing that. Let's see here. And then next thing I want to talk about is fishing pressure and boating pressure. So one thing that I just wanted to kind of call out that's a factor is obviously fishing pressure. I found a lot of times, for example, if you have an obvious point, like this obvious point that sticks out right here, and you get a lot of people fishing the spot, you'll find that a lot of times these bass will move from the obvious structure to the less obvious structure over like on a shallow shell bed or rock pile over here. I've talked about this in a lot of my videos, but just kind of making sure you guys keep this in your back of your head. If there's a lot of fishing pressure in your area, that can move the fish, and it can also change the baits you need to throw. So for example, if there's a lot of fishing pressure in this area and you get cloudy conditions and wind, you might think you need to pick up a crankbait or a spinnerbait or a moving bait. But if there's 6 guys fishing the same spot, in those conditions, those fish might get so much pressure that you might need to downsize to a little drop shot or a shaky head, and you can get more bites than everyone else fishing around you by going finesse and trying to beat the fishing pressure with going to a more finesse approach. So that's one thing to kind of take into account. Another one thing to pay attention to is the boat traffic. And one thing I've seen a lot that's really cool on your deeper, clearer lakes is a lot of times the boat traffic running across the lake will create a bunch of boat wakes. And there are times when those boat wakes can actually trigger these fish into biting. I've seen times where you run over a spot, a big giant pleasure boat or like a giant like 30 or 40 foot cruiser will drive over a point, and all of a sudden bait fish and fish will just start busting on the surface. And all of that turbulence in the water and everything causes those bait fish to move up, and they start feeding for whatever reason on the surface, or it causes the bass to push them up shallower. I don't know exactly what's going on there. Maybe there's some sort of like plankton and stuff on the surface that they're trying to eat. Maybe it's the algae bloom deal. Again, not 100% sure on how all that works, but I've actually gone out and driven around the circle sometimes and triggered schools of schooling fish with boat traffic. I've also seen at times when there's a lot of pleasure boaters running down the lake, it creates a mud line on the shoreline, and you can catch fish on the mud line created by pleasure boaters. Now, sometimes it actually hurts the fishing and makes it worse. Sometimes it makes it better, but there are times when those pleasure boaters can actually help you. I don't have a full list of times when that's the case. Unfortunately, I have seen a lot of times when I'm fishing offshore, though, where the pleasure boaters will hurt you more than help you. There's actually one creek on Lake Dardanelle, or one bay, that I crush them on Monday through Friday. But on Saturday and Sunday, when there's a bunch of pleasure boaters out there, you cannot buy a bite. It's like certain areas of the lake that get extra pressure from like wake boats, jet skiers, stuff like that. It will kill the offshore bite on that spot, and you cannot get a bite. So you can go there on Friday during your practice day and hammer them, catch 20 pounds, then go back on tournament day and you'll zero. Not because the fish are gone, because you can come back the next Monday and hammer them again, but it's because those pleasure boaters are in the area. So if you're fishing offshore, especially if the areas are shallower offshore areas, pleasure boaters can hurt you. Usually when the offshore fish are very deep in like 25, 30, 40 feet of water, that's when the pleasure boaters actually can help you more than hurt you. So what I would say is if there's a lot of pleasure boaters and you're fishing shallow water offshore, less than 15 feet, avoid those areas. Avoid the pleasure boat full areas when you're fishing in less than 15 feet of water offshore. If you're fishing in 25 plus feet of water, pleasure boaters are not going to bother those fish. You can actually get those fish triggered because of those pleasure boaters. So that is, and Ron asks, it's the same as schooling bass. Yes. Yeah. So that is kind of what I had. I got about 15 minutes to answer questions, which is awesome. I'm glad we did that. So let me go through some questions. And also, I'm going to answer questions. If anyone has any questions here, drop them in the Q&A, and I'll try to answer as many as I can. You got me for 15 more minutes, so throw them at me. Let's see here. Kyle said I have to sign off. Thank you so much for this. Can't wait to rewatch this on Monday. Awesome, Kyle. Thanks for signing up. Really appreciate the support and hope you enjoyed the seminar. Tom asks, as long as there is wind, do you find moving baits can be productive despite sunny conditions? Yeah, Tom, usually if it's like bright sun and some wind, I might not use as an aggressive of a bait. So I might not use, for example, a bright chartreuse crankbait or like a really bright spinnerbait. But what I'll do is I'll use a more translucent crankbait. So for example, in Lake Dardanelle, it's kind of a dirtier water lake, but there's times when it would clear up. And I use that as an example a lot because I used to fish a lot out there. When I would fish offshore brush piles and stuff with crankbaits, I wouldn't get any bites on my crankbaits when it was slick calm, but I'd catch them on a big 10-inch worm. Then once the wind started picking up, but there was sun, I would catch them on a translucent crankbait. So something that was like a blue gizzard shad color, like a Striking 6XD, where you could see through the sides a little bit, but it was still like had some paint on it. So you could see through the sides just a tiny bit. And then when it got cloudy and windy, I would go to a chartreuse blueback or like a solid sexy shad, like white side crankbait. And I'd catch them there. So usually I would go to more translucent baits with sun and wind, but still throw a moving bait. And then with the cloud cover, I'll go to a brighter, bolder paint style plus a moving bait. Corey says, pea soup algae bloom on Winnebago can be good on the offshore reefs. Yes, I'm actually going to try to fish for Lake Winnebago, Corey. Sometime here this summer, I'm heading up to Wisconsin to fish up there for a whole month. So might make a video on that. That'd be cool. Brand says, awesome info, all 3 hours. Thanks for the info. Appreciate it. And then Pleather said, this is great stuff, Johnny. Thank you. Appreciate that. Todd says, great seminar. Have you thought about when you're going to schedule the advanced electronics seminar? Todd, great segue there. Let me actually pull something up because let me get this pulled up here. I actually just posted the advanced electronics. I know a bunch of people have been asking about that. Let me share my screen because that literally just got posted. And if you guys want to, sign up for that, just head over to fishthemoment.com, go to the virtual seminars page. We just posted another advanced electronics seminar. So basically, we do this all the time, but this is basically going through all my advanced tricks for electronics. I talk about a ton of stuff I don't talk about in my videos. I save it for this seminar. I give up pretty much everything about electronics except for the stuff I put in this seminar. So this is like my juiciest juice for my electronic stuff. I try to save this just for this because I don't want to give the information out to everyone because this is stuff like the stuff that's too good to give out on free YouTube videos. So that's what the seminar is. 30 spots available. I'll probably open up more spots throughout, but definitely check that out. If you enjoyed the seminar, check out this advanced electronics seminar. If you want to learn more about your electronics, it's an awesome seminar. There's a lot of good juice in here. So definitely check out this one. The advanced jig seminar is also good, but like, go sign up for this too. I don't want to not have you guys sign up for this, but like go sign up for the advanced electronics one. Like that is the deal. It's going to be sweet. And it's always good. I always make it better every time too. I always try to improve on it as I learn new info. So this is a really, really good seminar, comparable to what you had tonight. And more so if you're like really into electronics. Let's see here. And Corey asks, another category, not sure if the mayfly hatch are weather related, but what your experience with the mayfly hatches? Yeah, Corey, I don't know. I don't know when the mayfly hatches happen, but I know that it's huge deal. Like whenever I have the mayflies hatching, like I see them in the morning in the trees and stuff, I just run to any place where I can see overhanging trees and if they're a buzzbait or a topwater or a frog. I need to learn more about when that happens because mayfly hatch is really, really big deal. And it can actually be really effective both shallow and offshore at times. But yeah, mayfly hatch is huge. I don't know when that happens though. Whenever I see it happening, I'm on the lake. I'm like, oh yes, there we go. But I'm not sure exactly when it happens. Let's see here. Sean says, can't wait for the app. Thanks for the info. Very dirty water at Atkins and Bailey today. Fishing was tough. The info helps a lot. Appreciate that, Sean. Thanks. Do small boats with small waters still make them active? I don't know how. It's usually for me, it's like those giant, like 50-foot or 40-foot or however, those giant boats that like you see where they leave wakes where it's like 3-footers in the wake of the boat. That's what I see really triggers them. The smaller boats doesn't really seem to impact them that much, from at least what I've seen. Brandon says, can't wait for that. Looks awesome. Cool. Is the electronics brand for specific? It's going to be for all brands, Sean. Doesn't matter what brand you have. All the information applies to all the brands. I'm not going to be talking about live scope or anything like that. It's all just 2D sonar, side imaging, down imaging, which all the brands have as a functionality. And I'll kind of talk about the differences a little bit between them. John says, good seminar. Definitely sign up for the electronics in April. Awesome. Appreciate that, John. Greg, nice job, Johnny. On wind, the current slide, the bass were positioned against the wind or current. Do you cast into the wind to bring the lure with the current? Yes, Greg, I always position my boat so I'm casting into the wind or into the current. You want to bring your bait with the current always. So always position your boat so that your nose is into the current and you're casting your bait so it's coming with the current. If that makes sense. Joshua says, it's been great. Much appreciated as always. What about subscribe to an app? But we'll hold off a bit long. Oh, was about to subscribe to app, but we'll hold off a bit longer. Did you mention an estimated release date? Joshua, we're gonna roll out like a test group here in the next month or so. And then we're gonna kind of see how that goes. I'm actually gonna use my Patreon members. So if you guys want to follow me on Patreon, it's there's links in all my YouTube videos and stuff, or on the website, fishthemoment.com. I'll show you guys. Anyone who's a Patreon member, we're actually gonna do like a closed beta for the app. And you'll be able to get it before anyone else does. And you can just go to fishthemoment.com, support Fish the Moment, go to Patreon. And you can even just go like a $5 member. And we're going to use the Patreon group to test the entire app. We're not going to have every lake in the country on it to start out, but we're going to have quite a few and kind of just you can kind of see what's going on. And I really appreciate actually, guys, if you did sign up to Patreon, even if it's just for a few months, just to help test the app. You're the guys that really want to make sure our giving feedback because we're trying to make this app as good as possible. It's going to be sweet. Like I really am excited about it. I think it's going to be a game changer, and I'm going to continue to tweak it after we release it so that we make it better and better. And any feedback we can get from you guys in the beta from Patreon members is going to help make it even better in the future. So yeah, definitely sign up for Patreon, even if just for a few months. And I think next month, or it's either next month. Like in April, we're probably going to launch it out to the Patreon members, most likely like sometime in April. So if you're already a Patreon member, awesome. If not, then go check it out. And will you be doing the PDF packet along with the seminar going forward? Greg, yeah, it depends on certain seminars. This one I had like specific graphics made up. I'm going to try to do that more often with these seminars to create, when it makes sense, to create those seminar packs. Or create the graphic packs with the slides or whatever. So I'm going to try to do that as best I can. I hadn't thought about that in the past because a lot of the slides I do like the dragging and dropping. So where it makes sense, if it isn't actually going to help, I probably won't. But at least for this seminar, definitely will. And I'll try to do it for as many seminars as I can going forward. That's something you guys enjoy. So yeah, I'll send over the recording of the seminar by Monday, guys. By Monday at 5 p.m. Central Standard Time, March 8th, and I'll send over the key slides that had like the summary information. I'll send those over in a PDF form for you guys as well. James says, before the last big cold front that swept through the deep south, the bass were up shallow on Lake Conroe, or temp was 61 before the front, but after the front, it dropped to 41. Went back to the areas I was catching fish, and there were no fish in sight. Do you think those fish pushed out deep? Yeah, James, they probably pushed out deep. They maybe didn't push out that far, but I bet they pushed out from like the shallow water areas, maybe out to that 8 to 10 foot range probably, and especially if you're on the lower end of the lake. The upper end of the lake where you have all the bushes and stuff, those fish, once that water starts to warm back up, they'll go right back into the shallow areas. But on the lower end, I know in Conroe, there's a lot of just like random stuff out in the middle of that lake in 8 to 10 foot, brush piles, stumps, cars, pallets, random stuff. That's probably what a lot of those fish are setting up on until that water temperature warms back up. Place says, what will the app be named? Give me Deep Dive, the Deep Dive app. What do you guys think of that? Actually, we'd like your feedback on that. What do you guys think of that name? Because that's our name. And then Robert asked here, what's your opinion on situations like clouds but no wind, also sun with no wind, sun but windy? These are variations. So what I find when there's clouds but no wind, those fish seem to really suspend a lot. For whatever reason, I don't know why, but they really like to suspend when it's cloudy and no wind. They spread out more and they're not super aggressive in terms of they won't like get tight to the bottom and like chase stuff. If you bring a bait by them though, they'll eat it. So when it's cloudy and no wind, they suspend. So I fish a lot of like jerk baits and swim baits in that situation because they'll still be aggressive, I guess, to eat, but they're not going to be bottom related. They'll be aggressive suspended, if that makes sense. It's kind of confusing. Now, when it's sunny and windy, usually those fish are tight to tight to the bottom and tight to shade, but they're very aggressive. So they'll be on the bottom in shade and feeding heavily. When it's cloudy and no sun, they'll still be feeding, but they'll be suspended, not tight to cover. Hopefully that makes sense. Joshua says, I'm in IT and enjoy the analytics. Awesome. You're going to like the app because there's some analytics in there as well. Gary says, total curveball question. Any tips on big cicada hatches? Our area is about to get one this summer. Is it like the shad kills? So I found I actually fished in a big cicada hatch a few years ago up in Wisconsin on Big Green Lake. I hate cicadas. They freak me out. So that whole tournament, I was like, I was hating it because they're flying into my face and they're giant. Oh, I hate that. So if there's cicada hatches when I go up back in Wisconsin, that's going to be terrible. Oh no. Anyways, so with the cicadas, we found that the fish were biting better offshore. They're more consistent because those cicadas were really set up well on the trees and stuff up shallow. So if you get further off the bank on the big flats and stuff, a lot of cicadas will fly out there, get caught by the wind and land on the surface. And that's a good feeding opportunity for those bass. So long, shallow flats are actually really good in those situations where you can get away from the shore out in the middle of the lake. So there's not as many cicadas up shallows. So those bass are a little more aggressive. So basically you have like the outside grass lines way off the bank on shallow flats. That's where I usually would find them better. At least the last time I dealt with that when I was fishing in Wisconsin, I was like 11. Cool. James says, love the seminar. Thanks, Greg. Will Patreon members get an email about the beta version and how do we get ready for testing? Greg, I will send an email out to everyone. And basically what I'll just do is say, hey, I think I'll need your like Apple ID or whatever. And then I'll send instructions in like a PDF or something. And it's just basically will give you permission with your Apple ID. I think that's at least how I got permission to use it. We have it in like I have the app right now actually on my phone that I can use and it works and stuff. But yeah, that's kind of what we're doing. So yeah, we'll figure it out. It'll probably be a work in progress. I'm going to test it with like Randy. And if Randy can do it, then I know we're going to be good. Randy says, awesome name. Good deal. Deep Dive works. I'm in. Deep Dive. Like the name. Cool. Yeah. And I'm thinking Deep Dive. It could look good on shirts. It could look good on hats. I don't know. Deep Dive seems kind of cool. Anyways, guys, really appreciate everyone signing up for the seminar. Hopefully you found it helpful. Again, I'll send out that recording as soon as possible. Send it over on Monday by 5 p.m. Central Standard Time. Definitely check out that upcoming advanced electronics seminar if you guys are interested. I would sign up now. They fill up really, really fast. And at some point, I can't add any more people with I do. So there's a hard cap on it. So definitely sign up. The last time I literally hit the hard cap and was not able to add any more people. So definitely sign up as soon as you can for that. It's available on the website right now. And other than that, really appreciate all the support as always. It's awesome to hear everyone's comments and just be able to bounce ideas off people. You guys are really, really cool guys, and just it's awesome to be able to share all this fishing information and find people who enjoy it. I love nerding out about bass fishing and sharing all of the secrets as best I can, and it's just amazing that I'm able to do it for a living, and you guys are able to help support that. So again, really appreciate it. I'll always try to bring top-notch information, always make sure I'm super prepared, have good graphics, slides, all that stuff. I never want to shortchange anyone. That's not my style. So I'll always keep bringing high-quality content, and look forward to seeing you guys either on YouTube or maybe on future seminars. So again, thanks for signing up, and talk to you guys soon.